Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting. My name is Veronica Villaseñor, and I work at DTSC's Public Participation Program. And on behalf of the department, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. Today's Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting is subject to a Bagley-King Open Meeting Act to preserve the public's transparency of the panel's discussion and decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Today we'll start the meeting by taking public comments on today's agenda items. We'll then hear a presentation from Dr. Gina Solomon of the Public Health Institute and the University of California at San Francisco on preliminary findings from a green chemistry law policy evaluation that she led, after which the panel will be given the opportunity to ask Dr. Solomon for clarifying questions. We'll then have a discussion on the evaluation and recommendations, and we'll end the day by hearing about SCP's recently developed preliminary analysis template, after which we will have a discussion and then close out the meeting. So let's start out with hearing from Meredith.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And I don't have too much to say other than yesterday, I think, lived up to its billing in terms of the level of interest and engagement and the contributions from the panel. We certainly, as typical, but even more so yesterday, got a lot of good feedback and food for thought that we will be following up on. And I'm quite confident that once Dr. Solomon makes her presentation, we'll have even more food for thought and more actions that we will want to consider. So I really want to just get on with it because I'm very much looking forward to that discussion. So I'm going to turn it over so we can do the public comment.
Before today's panel's discussion, we will take a public comments. If there are webinar participants who wish to comment at today's meeting, please email your comments at saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov, and it will be read aloud. Comments submitted remotely will be read to the panel after we hear from commenters from in the room. The public is reminded that today's comments are directed to the Green Ribbon Science Panel and on the agenda's topics. That is, the materials that were presented to the panel. Public comments directed to DTSC are not appropriate at this meeting. Please note that the panel is not able to respond to comments or to answer any questions as this meeting is a working meeting. If you have not signed up to comment, you may do so at this time. Staff have commenter cards for you to indicate that you wish to comment. Okay, no comments from the webinar? Okay, we don't have any comments, so now we're gonna go to our Green Ribbon Science Panel member, Elaine Cohen-Hubble, who is online.
Hi, thank you. Please let me know if you have trouble hearing and if this gets too tricky, and then I'll just finish writing my comments. I really thank you for this opportunity and I'm very disappointed not to be there in person. So yesterday I submitted one comment, and I'll just really quickly highlight that again just because it's so difficult to have these comments read. But this was in reference to the AA examples. There was a question on how to use the results of that to sort of guide future pilots and research. And I thought that was an exciting analysis, and I think it would be really important moving forward to put the lens on this AA, the alternatives assessment, to see what that kind of assessment would look like and how it would inform at the very early stages of chemical product design and development. We heard a little bit yesterday from some of the product manufacturers, which I thought was very enlightening. But what are the SCP elements that are informative of this stage in the process, and do the alternative assessments at this stage really inform how an alternatives assessment for SCP priority product chemical could be done? So just, can we think about these alternative assessments not just for what's really mature products and chemicals, but how those screening tools will be informative early on in the process. So I think it's been really exciting the way the Safer Consumer Products Initiative has advanced thinking on how we develop chemicals and products. And I would just like to see that overlaid in how we're thinking about alternatives assessment at all stages of chemical and product development. And then the other thing is sort of on the flip side, can we engage stakeholders to really develop retrospective case studies that demonstrate how the types of alternative assessments that meet these, kind of novel SCP regulations would have led to the same or different decision. And so how can these case studies really help us understand how to move forward in advancing the alternatives assessment practice? So that was yesterday's, and then I did have also a couple comments also from yesterday's discussions, and one was on following up on carpet and PFAS as the DTSC proposal, and was the Safer Consumer Products effective in communicating the need for a class approach. And I would like to just throw my hat in on the side that says, yes, indeed, that SCP has identified a really important example where class approach will support the goals of the regulation and facilitate informed substitution. In the first paragraph of the first section for the priority product chemical profiles, SCP did identify that the PFAS are all candidate chemicals due to their designation as priority chemicals under the California Biomonitoring Plan, CEP. But importantly, what is done in that profile is that they focus on, here are the PFAS chemicals that are used for carpet surface treatments and surface treatments. Here's the raw materials in those, the PFAS used in the raw materials for those surface treatment products. And here are the associated environmental designates that we know about along the chemical product life cycle for those surface treatments, right? So, and there are many. And any alternative assessment under SCP for this priority product chemical would need to address the feedstock, contaminant, degradates of any proposed alternative. So just from a science perspective, it's really hard to figure out how you could do this in any way other than using this kind of chemical class approach. So whether or not all 3,000 plus PFAS end up meaning, they're not going to all be specifically addressed in any alternative assessment, it would be hard to imagine how you could do this without taking a class approach. So I just wanted to note that I think that was laid out nicely in the document. And just one other thought on carpet and PFAS proposal. And this is nothing that you all do not know, but public concern around these chemicals, these PFAS class of chemicals, is really providing a very important driver to build capacity to anticipate potential impacts of alternatives. EPA and many others in academia, in the states, are actively in the process of collating and generating new information on the properties of these PFAS compounds, the transformations, the bioactivity, the occurrence, environmental media, and biomonitoring is also underway of what we know to be highly exposed population. In conjunction with that, EPA and others are also developing both targeted and, importantly, non-targeted methods for measuring the increasing numbers that we know about of PFAS in water, air, dust products. And so in many ways, for really all the stakeholders, this is a ripe time for innovating and proactively implementing alternatives to PFAS class. So I would just, kind of urge people to think about this, which I know is hard, if you're a regulated entity, but this is potentially an alternative to really control what happens next rather than have it sort of just happen. So, hard to breathe when I talk this fast. But this is on decision making. I really thought the guest speaker was fascinating. I think just for all of us to hear what it sounds like to be inside one of these more younger, innovative kinds of business models is really great. He noted the use of visualizations such as spider web type plots, and I did want to just throw out a pitch for the fact that there are. I'm also seeing in many of the really the collection of materials that were sent out for this meeting were just incredibly enlightening. But there's also places there in the decision-making references that were sent where the need for ways to look across disparate kinds of information, whether it be across the hazard endpoints or across the different elements that are important for making these decisions. How do you do that? And there are many examples that I think we could and should start applying just to see how they work. But one that I wanted to highlight is the ToxPi Toxological Prioritization Index, and that's an analytical framework that enables integration of multiple sources of information. And it's the type of tool that could really be used to support transparent, importantly, transparent documentation of the SCP elements and stakeholder decision criteria. There is a new ToxPi graphical user interface that I see has just come out, and so that's there for your reference. Then just one more quick thing, if you'll indulge me, because I'm a little, I don't know, soapboxy is a verb that I'm going to just kind of follow on to a lot of conversation yesterday. The SCP initiative and DTSC leadership have really been in this community, to which I'm one of the newer members, has really been a transformative force, in my opinion, for advancing chemical policy and management. And I just, I do want to really applaud the patience and persistence, the multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary dialogue, and I really encourage that these dialogues continue. So here's my soapbox. However, best science is moving very, very quickly. And then as as we all heard yesterday from the representatives from the consumer product manufacturers, there are a range of stakeholders, regulators, chemical, consumer product manufacturers, retailers, who are also moving quickly. They're moving quickly to use the new information, make decisions on the information, generate information. I'm also involved on a science panel for another jurisdiction that manages chemicals, and they're moving very quickly. So I think what I want to say is that rapidly, these groups, these stakeholders are rapidly developing, using new data streams in new ways to make decisions. And I would just really urge, I feel a real sense of urgency, and I would just hope that moving forward, we as a community can really demonstrate some agility in thinking and in practice, so that this initiative can really continue to lead, so that the goal of moving forward to make better decisions is, one that we're moving on consistently and quickly, because that conversation about the perfect versus the better is, I think something we should all take to heart. So thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to today's conversations. I'm hoping maybe you could just leave me on the phone because I have no power and can't see the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your comment. As there doesn't seem to be any more comments, We will close the public comment period for today.
There. Thank you very much. And I really want to thank Elaine. The hurricane is bearing down on her home and on all the folks in the Carolinas, and our thoughts are with everyone there, including Elaine. I really wish that she were here and part of this discussion, because she's contributed an awful lot in her short tenure. And I'm looking forward to having her be part of our discussion at our next meeting. So I appreciate everyone's forbearance and listening to all of her stuff combined into that small time, because that's all we're allowed to do under the law. So now it's time to move on, and I'm just incredibly excited to introduce Dr. Gina Solomon of the Public Health Institute. And I just want to, there was an inadvertent error in the materials, but Gina's here in her role as the principal investigator at the Public Health Institute to present a study to us. And as Julie mentioned before she left yesterday, it is one of the great things that can happen with a good program is to have a review of it after it's been around for a little while. It's a hard thing to do in a lot of different ways, but it's actually really, really important for periodic reviews of particularly science-based regulatory programs. Before Gina starts, I'll just note that she's a medical doctor, and in addition to her role as principal investigator at the Public Health Institute in Oakland, she's a clinical professor of medicine in the Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine at UCSF. From 2012 to 2017, she was appointed by Governor Brown as the Deputy Secretary for Science and Health at the California EPA. She also served as the Director of Occupational and Environmental Medicine Residency Program at UCSF from 2008 to 2012. She was the Associate Director of the UCSF Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit from 2003 to 2009, and she also worked as a Senior Scientist at NRDC from 1996 through 2012. She's on a whole array of really important national roles at the NAS, EPA, and elsewhere. And she's really uniquely positioned in the chemicals policy arena with her background and science experience at the edge of science and public policy. So it's an incredible opportunity for this program in the state to have Gina taking the lead on this review. So I'll turn it over to Gina.
Thanks. And I guess for the webinar, I should probably stand up here, even though it feels kind of removed from the panel.
And you could sit once we get into discussion.
Yeah, that
maybe it'd be more
sounds
comfortable.
great. So I'm so happy to be here, and it's an honor to have a chance to get the thoughts of the people in this room, because I have spoken with some of you individually, but I haven't spoken with many of you about this project, and I'm at a stage right now where I have preliminary findings. I'm putting those together into recommendations, and it's a great opportunity to basically hone and refine where this project and final report is going. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to be here yesterday. I would have liked to have been, but the confluence of the Global Climate Summit and this and a number of other things, the Western Occupational Medicine Association meeting and a few things, have made it a kind of crazy week. But I'm happy to be here today, even though I'm missing Al Gore. But, well, you know. So this project is funded by the California Breast Cancer Research Program. They have a special initiative around policy projects in which they're funding a number of relatively short-term policy-focused projects that they think may be relevant either directly or indirectly to breast cancer or chemicals that may cause breast cancer. So that's where this came from, and it's being run by the Public Health Institute, which is a nonprofit entity based in Oakland with a global reach and that manages a research budget of about $110 million a year, so on all kinds of different public health issues. I'm relatively new there, but it's quite an amazing place. And the purpose of this project really is to think about, we're really 10 years out. One of the interviewees of this project said, oh my gosh, 10 years, how could it be 10 years? How did that happen? So we are 10 years out from the passage of the legislation that created the program. And, it's a reasonable time to look at whether there are any policy enhancements that could strengthen the program and assist in the implementation going forward. And we convened, I hope you can see the names here, but an advisory group with a little bit of overlap with this panel. Thanks, Meg. And a number of great folks, either in the breast cancer world or in the policy world, mostly with government and NGO background. And the project was a qualitative research project, which was new to me. Fortunately, I had, as one of my co-investigators, Annie Huang, who is a medical student at UCSF, but it also has a strong background in qualitative research. So it was great to be able to learn from one of my medical students. And I did learn a lot. We did a purposeful sampling approach in which we compiled a spreadsheet of experts for potential interview, then narrowed the list according to a set of predefined criteria, and then conducted interviews that were tape recorded, professionally transcribed, and then coded in a software system called Deduce, which allows you to excerpt and organize relevant sections of text. And as you can see, we sort of divided people up a little bit by perspective, and so I'll often have next to quotes a little bracket, just kind of with a, some kind of a perspective as to how the person defined themselves. Some cases by their affiliation, NGO, government, et cetera, or by their expertise as a scientist or attorney. We had some folks from outside California, but it was skewed to California folks for obvious reasons. So let's get right into the meat of what the interviews found. Just to go back, a couple other elements to this. Obviously, a literature review was a necessary piece of the project, and then there's another component that relates to a list of chemicals that are potentially associated with breast cancer, and looking at how those do or don't appear in the chemicals associated with this program. And I'm not going to be talking about those latter pieces so much today. I'm really focusing on the expert interviews because I think that the most exciting and interesting findings came out of those. So one of the open-ended questions in the interviews was, what do you see as the strengths of the Safer Consumer Products program in particular? And as you can see, by far, three-quarters of the interviewees immediately went to the concept of unique, innovative, saying, I think that California is trying to do things that nobody's done before. That was a fairly typical type comment in that vein. There was also this idea of, California just being such an important model, and I think Elaine also mentioned that just now in her comments. So that I heard over and over again from all different perspectives. It really didn't matter who the interviewee was. They tended to, most came to that. But there were a lot of other issues that came up, and some of them were sort of interesting in that, for example, alternatives assessment was mentioned quite a bit, but not by any of the folks from business as a strength. And the chemical list also was mentioned a fair amount, but again, by the other kind of perspectives and not so much from business folks. And then on the flip side, regulatory flexibility was mentioned just by government and business experts. And so you sort of saw a little bit of difference from across the different perspectives. But I'm going to actually be touching more on most of these issues. And quite a few people specifically talked about the indirect effects of the very existence of the program, the list, the process, and pointed out that kind of behind the curtain, some people said, or, behind the scene, that there are reformulations that have already been occurring. And I heard that, again, also from people from within the business community, as well as folks from outside the business community, sort of predicting or from their knowledge of what's going on out there. Okay, but let's get to some of the challenges, because that's really where we might have some areas to delve more deeply into today. And the challenges that came up, I ended up coding those according to data excerpts rather than according to interviewees, so you'll see a different scale on the x-axis. That's because pretty much everybody talked about pretty much everything, so it would have been a boring bar graph. And also because I asked some specific questions about a number of these areas, and so that kind of skewed the way the data would look. But by looking at the number of excerpts, it really got into like how much did people really dig into these different areas. And as you can see, there were really two that sort of are the highest. What we coded as slowness, which really is the pace of the program, and data gaps with 100 excerpts and 99 excerpts, respectively, in each of those areas. So quite a lot of meat to digest. Alternative analysis came in just behind, and then a number of other issues. And again, you see that there's really all of the different perspectives spoke on all of these different issues. But there was a real split. And the split was on the pace of the program, where almost universally the folks from more NGO or academic perspectives made comments that were really expressing deep concern about what they saw as the slow pace of the program. Very impatient, very concerned about it. On the other side, the folks from business universally actually said that they didn't feel that the program was moving too slowly, or even if it was moving slowly, that it was appropriate because there's a need to move deliberatively, and then perhaps over time the program would speed up naturally. So there was that big split. The government folks actually were split. There were some in each of these two camps. So I guess, the main takeaway, I think, from this is that there's a lot of impatience from the NGO organizations right now that we all need to be aware of, because there's some, they're trying to figure out how to move forward more quickly. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to be aware of that and think about it. In terms of accelerating the pace of the program, there were actually quite a few recommendations in many different camps, and I'm just going to run quickly through a bunch of them and then dig more deeply into one that I think is very intriguing. So mandates and deadlines came up quite a lot. There should be strict timelines, strict deadlines for action. There were other folks who said, well, it's just because the program is so broad, huge list of chemicals, a huge universe of products, it's very hard to move quickly. And maybe one solution would be to try to focus in more. Then there were folks who pointed to the statute itself or the regulations or the implementation as problematic. And in particular, some folks who said, well, it might be a good idea to just sort of evaluate the process and think about how the process could be streamlined effectively. So those were different perspectives. And then there was also quite a lot of concern, 66 excerpts specifically saying, there's a funding problem here, a staffing problem, and that makes it very hard to move quickly. There's not a dedicated funding mechanism, and so that, that would be a solution. But this suggestion surprised me, and it's the one that I am focusing most on here because I really want your thoughts on this, which is, this person described it well, saying, well, there's only one bucket right now, one sort of, or some people said there's only one track through this program. And so maybe there should be a fast track and an R&D track for things where there's, where some chemicals chemical product combinations are kind of obvious. Why do we need to go through this whole process versus others where you really do need the process because it's a very complicated substitution challenge? And there were a number of folks who fleshed that out. And when I analyzed all the excerpts, just to sort of summarize, the three categories that came up that might, some people were saying you could just skip really to a presumptive regulatory response. You don't necessarily need an AA if you have a chemical that is not necessary for the function of the product. Some people specifically mention the nap mats with flame retardants in that category as an example. That other folks pointed to, well, if you already have major players in the industry that have made a switch, so it's obviously feasible and workable to do, is that something that could go into a fast track? And the third thing that came up was relevant to your discussion yesterday is, well, if there's a good AA already out there, why not use that and not require it to basically, be repeated and go through the whole process? So those were issues that came up. There also was quite a bit of discussion around whether the legislature should or should not act on chemicals. A lot of controversy around that broke down by perspective, as everyone can imagine. But the idea that I thought was really interesting that came out here was, well, okay, what about if the legislature does really want to act? What about sort of going straight to the AA and saving that whole process of, having to go through a rulemaking to list a chemical product combination? Could the legislature do that? That would basically allow a process to evaluate the alternatives, avoid regrettable substitution, which is what people would want. And so that would be another type of potential fast track. So this is, I think, a very intriguing idea. I want to know if you think it's an intriguing idea, and what you might suggest along these lines. Moving on to data gaps. This was an issue also that came up just about as often as the pace of the program. And the main area that people focused on was around product ingredient information, chemical use information, feeling that there was a bit of a, sort of, somebody used the term stumbling in the dark as sort of a risk that, the program can spend a lot more time than they need to. So this was related to the slowness, was basically, if there's not enough data out there in some areas and it's difficult to find, does that slow the program down? So that was something that came up quite a bit, and there was some suggestion that the program may have some authority in that area that they could exercise, but that maybe they need clearer authority in that area so that they can go out and obtain data when they need it. And there were some interesting opportunities there, too, that came up. There were people who talked about the need for more transparency throughout the supply chain, because it wouldn't only benefit DTSC, it benefits a lot of players in the supply chain to have more transparency. And then there was actually some willingness from the business community to not, universally, but much more than I expected, to share product ingredient information. And there was also quite a bit of understanding from the NGO community that I didn't also totally expect, that some types of information should be kept confidential. And there were a number of folks from the NGO community said that, really it's been the abuses of the CBI process, the confidential business information process, that have been the problem, not the fact of having some information CBI. So I actually, in at least the subsample that I looked at, saw more convergence than I ever expected to see on the CBI issue. It gave me a lot of hope, so I put these issues under opportunities. There was a lot of there were a lot of ideas about how to fill the data gaps, some of which were, around allowing DTSC access to a lot of data that would then be kept confidential, largely, versus much more of a public disclosure of information, versus sort of more focused but enforceable data call-ins that would be on specific issues or questions. And so when you talk about filling this data gap, there are all kinds of different ways to do it. And so I'd also be interested in your thoughts on that. Now, most people did speak about data gaps on chemical use and product ingredients, but there were a fair number who also spoke about other data gaps. People who pointed out that exposure is actually, even though the program is somewhat hazard-based, there is an exposure finding that has to happen, and that is really challenging in some cases, and that there's a need for more monitoring data and exposure data collection. Somebody saying specifically they should support the California Biomonitoring Program, and this came from someone in the business community, which is why I thought it was particularly interesting. And then there were also people who talked about the new, and again, going back to what Elaine said this morning, the new rapid toxicology data that are out there as well. So how do we get a better handle on that and use it more effectively? That came up as a challenge. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on prioritization, though there was a lot of thoughts on prioritization. I have to say, zero consensus emerged on how to prioritize chemicals. There were ideas all over the map. There were people who I love the term, look for the sick antelope, basically look for chemicals that already have one foot out the door, where just California can, by listing it, really take it off the market, change the industry. There were other people who said you got to start taking more shots on goals, start defining the edges. So that's really a different approach of taking on more difficult substitution challenges. Quite a few people talked about classes of chemicals or classes of products or functional use categories. And even some people said, well, look at a certain hazard trait like neurotoxicants came up because of their effects on kids. And then others who said, you should jump around, because if you just send the signal, you're going to focus in on one product or one chemical class or something. Somebody said, well, if you just send the signal, you're going to look at PFAS in 18 different categories of products. Everybody else is just going to go to sleep because they're not, they don't see themselves as having to pay any attention to the program. And then there's also this idea, I just like this quote, so I put it in there, but relevant to food packaging, which is a very broad product category with a lot of chemicals in it, and it's in the work plan, and it's a challenge. And this was somebody from the NGO community saying, yeah, you can look at one piece of that, but you've still got a crap load of other toxic stuff, which I thought was sort of, one perspective about this push to go broad. So many people said that this program would have an impact by going broad, but then there were other people who said, but you don't want to go too broad because then you sort of drown. So as I said, no consensus on this issue, but it's obviously going to be an ongoing challenge. Going on to alternatives analysis. The challenge here, people, the folks from the business community are really worried about this. And, this first quote really exemplified it. If I happened to be at the point of this lance, I would chew my arm off rather than do an alternatives analysis. That was a very vivid way of putting it. But it's this concern that it's going to be a just indeterminate amount of work, amount of expense, without, and it would be easy to bog down. And there were people from other perspectives, not just the business perspective, who are very concerned that this whole process will just bog down and not lead to action and lead to a sort of a clear, beginning, middle, and end, and outcome that, and then one person really focused in on the economic analysis piece, finding that especially almost, impossible to do and very problematic. So that, I think, is something that, I'm so glad that you're thinking about the AA process, because we really need to think about how to make it more effective. Not really more effective because nobody's done it. That's the problem. It's all hypothetical. So, I'm talking to all these people and they have all these ideas, all these suggestions, and all these worries, but, we don't know how much of that is going to play out. Now, this slide is murder to read, so don't even try, but the point is that there are examples from Massachusetts, Maine, the European Union, BizNGO, all these other entities out there that have been looking at AAs. I think Washington State also, couldn't fit it on the slide, has also a different model where they do a collaborative AA and bring different stakeholders to the table to talk about it. Some of, Maine has this nifty thing where if they get an AA that doesn't meet standards of quality, they can actually charge a fee and have a third party do it. And that would be one way of sort of ensuring that you get a high quality product. The EU, as many people know, has more of a sort of a rebuttable presumption where the AA is basically used to show that something cannot be substituted. So if you think you can't get rid of this chemical and substitute it in a safer way, then you step forward. So these are different thoughts. The idea of a third-party review of the AA came up quite a bit as a way to maybe address some of the resource issues within the program, but that would require some kind of a fee, which also raised concerns. Folks in the business community were like, wait a minute, those poor companies that are doing the AA are already going to be spending a lot of money to do it. And then if you charge them a fee to review it, that'll be even more onerous. But then there were some people, including from the business community, thought that there already was a fee for the review of the AA. And I actually had to go back to the regs and go, I don't think so. And in fact, there is not. So it's interesting that there were people who already thought that there was a fee to review the AAs. Now I'm going to just touch on a couple other areas because SB 509, the quote, other green chemistry law that passed at the same time and was double joined to AB 1879, so it's kind of a part of the analysis too. There are two components to that, the Toxics Information Clearinghouse and the hazard trades. Not as many people were familiar with this law, but the people who were actually kind of over the moon about the hazard trades. The people who knew about this, they said that these are really interesting. And the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OEHA, did something really kind of cutting edge there that aligns really well with the new toxicology, the predictive toxicology that allows you to look at indicators or pathway-based effects. And so this whole concept is very interesting. There were some people who said it should be updated maybe a little bit more, and a lot of the people who were familiar with it kind of went, wow, this was really interesting, but then what happened with it? And so there was interest in whether those could be integrated better into the program and used more. And there were some specific ideas here. One had to do with the concern that the Canada Chemicals List might get a bit stale, and that it doesn't cover emerging chemicals, and that therefore using some of the information from the new toxicology combined with the hazard traits, even if it didn't feed directly into the Canada Chemicals List, that could sort of help identify emerging chemicals that might need to be watched more closely. And then the Toxics Information Clearinghouse was in marked contrast, universally either greeted with a shrug of the shoulders or a what is that, or I looked it up right before I did this interview with you because I didn't even know it was there. Nobody I know uses it. You can get more out of a Google search than you can out of the tick. All of those kinds of comments. Other people saying, it was a good idea at the time, but now there's so many other resources out there. So a lot of people saying it's really not useful. That was clear. The question is what to do with it. And there was a split with some people saying, pull the plug, it's not useful. Let's just use what else is out there. The state does not have the resources or the IT capability to do this. Other people saying, well, we've got this law, we've got this, we have a responsibility to try to do something with this and to make it right. And that there might be ways to repurpose it and actually to use it to plug some useful information into other entities like the International eChem portal was mentioned. And so that also is something where I'd be interested in thoughts from people in this room. Two specific ideas that came out were, one, if there were more data call-ins, whether that information or some of it could go onto, into this, or the other is maybe if the hazard traits and maybe Iaea should take over this function and use it for in association with the hazard traits reg. All right, so I think we don't have a lot of time for this, but I am intending in the final report to devote actually a reasonable amount of time to these last two areas because I think they were left behind in the statutes that created this program. And they were important ideas back then, and they are still important ideas, and there's still a role for them. And one is more around education of green chemists and education on of experts to conduct alternatives analyses. All of that needs to happen. There needs to be more partnership between business and academia and government around really the positive side here, not the regulatory side, but the let's move this agenda forward, and also partnerships with business around developing safer chemicals. This idea of X prizes came up a few times. And so this is a piece that is a little bit, maybe, it's certainly not directly related to the Safer Consumer Products Program, but I'm also interested in thoughts around this. It's a challenge to fund, but a lot of people pointed to clean energy and California's commitment to that issue, and the sort of can't we do that in this area? Why can't we really create some momentum? So I'm sorry, these questions are a little bit difficult to read probably from where many of you sit, but these were, I have a lot of questions for you and a lot of interest in your thoughts in a lot of areas. So I'm just throwing these up. Really questions about how to optimize the pace of the program. Do you think this idea of faster tracks and more deliberative tracks makes sense? If so, do you have suggestions about how to define those? How concerned are you about the data gaps issue? Do you have suggestions about how to how to address that, and then what are your thoughts about sort of the new toxicology and how to fold that into maybe the hazard traits, streamlining the AAs, and oh right, and then this other thing, question 7, is one possibility with all these different suggestions around how to prioritize would be, would this panel be an appropriate forum to do kind of a look back on the prioritization process so far, how it's gone, what maybe could be done to think about what worked, what didn't work so well, how it could be improved. And would that be something that might be worth doing like within the next year or so? Because if so, that might be, you guys might actually be the right group to help think about this in a more in-depth way. So that's another suggestion. And then, and revitalizing the academic and business partnerships piece of green chemistry. So that's it. And sorry, it's kind of a lot to squeeze into, and I went over time, I'm sorry. So should I sit down and then we'll just sort of have a discussion, or are there any questions before?
Why don't you hang out for just a minute for, we usually do informational and clarifying questions, and I'm really going to ask everybody to keep it just to that. And then we can follow up with the discussion. And I think given the number of questions we have, it's going to be more efficient to do at least one once around the room. And then we can come back and do follow-up. We'll see how much energy there is, but I think it's going to be hard to do our normal back and forth on that. So we'll start with stuff that's just informational and clarifying. And while we're doing that, Dr. Solomon, you flipped very quickly through a couple slides about the pace of the program, and I'm wondering if you could go back and just let us look at those slides again.
Sorry. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were going to be getting a copy of the slides in advance.
Yeah, we did not. So, and this contains some things that are.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff to digest.
And before this, I think there were 2, okay, so yeah, so the next slide. Yeah, so if you could just leave that up there for a minute for us to start, and I'll just to take a look at it. And I think the next one, this is the only one I think you flipped through really fast, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, if anybody wants to see any other ones, I'll let you ask for that. And so now I'm looking for informational and clarifying questions. And I see Ann to start. Oh, Mark was trying first, so I'm going to let Mark go. And Ann, you're not? Okay. And then Jack. Oh, okay. Mark and Jack.
Yeah, the question I have is general. I mean, there's a lot of sort of recommendations, for example, the fast track process to do things more quickly. And I'm wondering what is within the realm of the agency and what is within the realm of the legislature who created the process by which the agency has to do things. I mean, I don't think the agency can just decide by themselves that we're going to create a fast track program. Or can they? I mean, if they can, they can. But if they can't, then it's not really so much a criticism of the agency as a criticism of the legislature in setting up the program. So I'm sort of wondering your perspective on the percent of all the recommendations that are made, what sort of percent are in the hands of the agency for what they can do?
Well, first of all, these aren't exactly intended as criticism. They're just sort of evaluating what and basically conveying what people are seeing out there in the program. And some of these would definitely or very likely require legislative action. Others could be done through administrative changes. But sort of creating fast track type approaches likely would, I'm not an attorney, so, but would likely require some action by the legislature.
As we go to Ann, I just want to clarify, I think the scope of this review is actually bigger than safer consumer products because you included all the green chemistry issues. And it's my understanding that the review and our participation in this are actually intended to be supportive of the program, and that a good review helps a program take a look at itself and get itself back on track. So I'm personally not seeing this as a criticism and not negative feedback to the staff, but rather constructive. We're having a constructive dialogue here to help provide some information here and to the program about looking forward. You know, what is it that might make it stronger and better and more robust, and other things that we're thinking about. So I've got Ann and then Jack.
Thanks, Kelly. You took the words right out of my mouth. That this is a great opportunity, and thank you, Gina, for doing this work. And it's really helpful to be able to look back now that we have some substance to look at and see how do we do it better. It is a little terrifying that we've been doing this for 10 years or more. So my clarifying question is, you said something. You had a quote that said, "Skip straight to the AA." Is the idea behind that you bypass the regulatory listing and therefore save time?
So do you mean this one? Yes. This was something that came up when I was asking people about the role of the legislature, which was, because there's this sort of tension about whether the legislature still should be, looking at chemicals or not. And so some people said very much, the legislature should still be absolutely free to act if they choose. Others saying, the legislature really should stay out of it. It's not a good forum for dealing with complex technical issues that should be dealt with at the department level. So those two perspectives. And then there was this sort of middle perspective that I thought was particularly interesting, which is, maybe there is a role for the legislature, but there should also then be, the legislature could then skip and save quite a bit of time and effort if they want to act, but there should then still be some alternatives, ability to look at alternatives and think about whether there really is a safer alternative before, something is banned, for example, in a product.
And so I think my follow-up question would be, as we get into the discussion, which is, how did this work for the lead and battery listing onto, which I don't really understand how that happened. So if you want to address that now or later.
Sure. The difference is that the legislature directed us to put lead and batteries in the priority products work plan, which means that that it's a little more specific than a category, but it's saying evaluate it to determine if we want to move it forward as a potential priority product, which would then require rulemaking.
All right, Jack, then Tim.
One of my questions/comments was exactly what Mark said. Does the law itself actually allow a shortcut? Because I've heard A to M so many times that that's a lot of things that a business would have to cover. And the same thing, the regulatory agency also has to cover that. It's a lot of things to consider. The other question, on the business community with which you interviewed, were any of the stakeholders, those industries who are being impacted by the initial priority products group? I mean, not trade associations, not business groups, but actually the companies involved.
That's an interesting question. Yes, actually, among the business interviewees, the business community is really diverse. It was actually a little hard to get a handle on who all to interview because I spoke with some folks who are more in the sort of chemical manufacturing end of the business, others that do product manufacturing, others that represent a variety of different companies and have represented those entities before the program. So it was sort of a mix. Then some folks who are more sort of in the green chemistry business space. Yes. And it was sort of, I was trying to avoid too much talk about any specific product chemical combination. And so even though those did come up, I mostly sort of steered away from that. not totally, but I'm glad you mentioned the A through M criteria. There were a number of people who talked about them, and again, there was a split. So many things, there was a split between some people saying it's horribly onerous. There was somebody who said if there was one thing I could change in the regulation, it would be, or in the statute, sorry, not in the if there were one thing I could change in the statute, it would be the A through M criteria. On the other hand, there were other people who were like, those criteria are great. They require you to take a really broad look. There was somebody who said, I use those. This was actually somebody from the business community said that he uses those to teach and uses them within their company because he thinks that they require that broad systems thinking. And then somebody else who's pointed to CEQA and said, it's kind of like a CEQA analysis, and you can do a neg deck in a day or two. It's not a big deal. So there was that spectrum reflected there too. I didn't get into that. So it's sort of interesting it depends on how you think, I guess, about the depth of each of those issues.
Exactly. So I've got Tim, and we're at informational and clarifying questions, and then we'll move on to comments. And I'm looking at a go around the room as this first part on comments in response to so many things, and probably we'll be starting that with Tim too.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if we could start on the other side, because I went first yesterday.
All right. Would you like
also, what's that?
Okay, I don't want to be in the middle of you, but I'd be happy to let Mike go first if you'd prefer.
So I wanted to ask you a question. Can we talk about that process of going around the room and answering all the questions before we do it? I just had a suggestion for a different way of doing it, but I'm going to now ask my clarifying question. First, I think this is terrific. That was a great presentation, and this is, I think, what a great process you guys set up and all. So I can't wait to read the report. My question has to do, I'm trying to figure out what the findings really mean, in the sense of, I agree with a lot of what's in here. Well, I mean, I'm on one side or the other of some of the things where there are splits, but I think a lot of this resonates. And but I'm curious, when you make these findings, are you thinking about here's a vote among experts and here's what most experts say? Because this part of it seems to be written that way, as opposed to you looking at what different people said and then trying to be kind of an umpire or referee. So this thing reads more like, here's where the consensus is, so let's make some changes. And I'm wondering if your intention is, when you write your report, to kind of dig in and, call it out. Because one of the things I notice is, the slides kind of count excerpts and, so here's how you, and I'm wondering if you're kind of planning on doing your own kind of independent viewpoint and that. So that's what I'm curious about.
Yes, and the answer is yes, but that I haven't, on some of these issues, I haven't fully refined that. I'm actually in the process of doing it now, and I have draft recommendations, but there is still an opportunity to hone them, and I'm still having individual. I'm doing the second round right now, where I'm having some one-on-ones and then some presentations with groups to just sort of get thoughts. But also, I did put my thumb on the scale on some of these slides, so some of them I just sort of tabulated. But like with this sort of separate tracks, faster track, slower track thing, I didn't tabulate that. I just thought it was a particularly intriguing idea that I wanted to pull out, and because to be honest, it is something that I'm thinking about. And so if you say, oh, it's a terrible idea, that will be good to know. And if you say it's a good idea, but when might enhance it in that way, that would also be good to know. But yeah, on a lot of these issues, I am going to have to come down with some recommendations, which people could either like or not like. But I am mostly trying to describe what I heard at this point, because really I didn't hear too many things that I thought were dead wrong. There's a lot of nuance here, especially like on this the pace of the program issue, where I heard a lot of passion on different sides. But all of those perspectives I thought were sort of coming from a good place of, You know, there weren't people who were saying, well, I don't want this program to work. And so if it slows down forever, that would be okay. And there weren't people who were saying, well, you just need to sort of tumble forward and make decisions regardless of whether they're good or bad decisions. Yeah, I mean, everybody was somewhere, you know, coming from a good place on it. But there were differences of opinion, obviously.
Mike, and then I want to wrap up the informational and clarifying questions.
Yeah, and a simple question. With the pacing issue that there was a lot of polarity around, are they talking about the pacing of the number of priority products that are coming out? Or are they talking about how rapidly it goes from, we're going to start to propose one, it proposes, there's workshops, and the whole process once one starts?
I think both, but that is a good question. I think some folks kind of conflated the two, and others were just sort of thinking generally that, you know, that, and thinking about the fact that really nothing has gotten across the so-called finish line in terms of having, you know, gone through an AA process, so that there were people who were saying, well, we still don't really fully know how the system will work. Because of that. So there are concerns about on all of those fronts, yeah.
I miss Ken Geiser. Ken?
Gina, thank you very much. I also thought the report was very good and enjoyed reading it and all, and I thank you all for doing it. But that also raises the question for me, just for clarification, because I do want to make some comments, but I'll hold those. But where do you see this report? Who do you think the audience of it is, and is it likely that the Public Health Institute presents this to the legislature, or is this a publication for journals, or how do you get this out, and who do you think is the readership?
There is a journal article that is in review right now, actually, and so it will very likely be coming out, you know, as a journal article sometime, I hope, this fall. The report will also be coming out this fall, and it really is wonky, so it's really mostly for the, I mean, you know, I think it's riveting reading, and you do too, but many people out there in the real world will not find it riveting reading. But, you know, there is going to be a new administration coming in. There's, you know, there's quite a bit of interest in the legislature in this program. And actually, I think the legislature really does want this program to work for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that they don't want to have to deal with figuring out what to do about chemicals. So they want an effective program here. And so there's, I think, some potential, if there are some legislative adjustments or some regulatory or just process adjustments, that, you know, at all of those levels, there could be some interest. There is a follow-on, a little bit of follow-on funding to do some dissemination and engagement around the report once it does come out. And so that's going to be running into January, February, March, when there will be new legislators and a new governor. And so that might help sort of get it out there.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon. At this point, I'm going to want to bring this back to the panel, so probably now's a good time to have a seat and be a little more relaxed. And Tim had a suggestion. I'm struggling here with how to do this. We have 10 questions from Gina plus another half dozen from the staff in our packets. We have 45 minutes before a break and then another hour thereafter. So I think we could probably easily go through all of that. And I love the more interactive form of discussion, but I'm looking at the number of various things that are out there and thinking that a once around would help us pull out what the main issues are. And then we could consult at the break and come back and talk about some more things, particularly if folks identify stuff for discussion. But I'm really interested in what Tim Malloy has to suggest here.
I was feeling that like the once around on all the questions to see where we are really kind of makes it hard to have, it's great, if what you're trying to do is prioritize what to talk about, then it might be better to ask people, what do you want to talk about, rather than to ask us all to comment on everything, because I just feel like then that we lose like the value that is inherent in this group of the putting your card up when you want to say, then the back and forth, and it hones in on things. So I don't think having us all say something about what we think is important as a prioritization tool works. I'd rather see us kind of go around quickly and say, here's what we think we should talk about, or do something to get priority, and then have set amount of time to talk about the most important questions with a more interactive, because I think the thing with the card really allows you to kind of gauge interactively about what people want to talk about, because when there's no more cards, then no one wants to talk about it at that point. You know, I say this with great respect and affection. I'm not trying to, it's just like I feel like when we do that thing, it kind of puts a drag on the conversation. And it's hard to answer, 8 questions in 30 seconds. Do you know what I mean? So that's all. And I'm happy with however you want to do it. I just want to kind of raise that as a possible.
Just editorially, I also like a more dynamic conversation. But I just wanted to offer to recraft the questions from the program, because I think we don't need to go through all of these. I think the general question is, are there observations that you all have that are significantly different than what you heard today? Just in generally, did something surprise you or is inconsistent with what you've seen? And then somewhat getting to this question about prioritization on anything that you feel is actionable. So that's kind of the overarching.
Are folks good with those 2 questions? Maybe that's where we should start. So the first one is, do you have observations that are different or in addition to the ones that we heard today? And the second one is, do you have suggestions for implementation priorities or implementation of the recommendations? Is that how you said it? Yeah. Okay. I'm actually super interested in folks's. If folks, the first question here, do you have observations that are different or in addition to those? Would folks be good with? I want to make sure that at some point here, we do have the ability to let everybody weigh in on other stuff. And maybe what we should do is do that at the end and start with the conversation, because I hear a lot of energy for a conversation. So I'm going to suggest we start with, do you have observations that are different than or in addition to what's there? So this is where scientists are really good at poking holes, and I think you all are particularly skilled in this area, and I see Helen, Jack, and Ken.
So many people talked about the pacing, and obviously this idea of a fast track has come up. Just a little bit of go back in time, if you recall, that was actually one of the original ideas, was to have multiple paths. And I find it very interesting that the people who are asking for a fast track are the ones who killed the fast track in the first place, because it was the progressive voices that said we could not lower the bar for anyone under any circumstances. And so we had to hold everybody to the same very high standard. And so I see nodding, yeah, we all remember this conversation, right? So, and so that would be my concern about spinning up any sort of major effort to try to get a fast track. I have a very strong sense that that's where we'd end up in terms of the content. Now, what the action I would suggest we think about is instead asking the question, what is legally allowable within the scope of the regs, and then also in the legislation for injecting into a later part of the process. So with lead acid, it forced it into the work plan. Can we go a little bit farther and force it to rulemaking? I don't know if anyone has thought to that. But like, sort of like push the boundaries of what's there, then figure out if we needed to make an amendment to inject further into the process.
Thanks, Helen. So we've got Jack, Ken, and Ann.
Just, this is a comment on the research done for the paper, but also it's a comment on the industry itself, and that is you listed a number of alternative assessments all done by the biz NGOs and things like that, yet one of the things that industry's been pointing out for a decade is this is what industry does every day, and yet there aren't any representatives from industry on that list. So I think it's a criticism of industry. Two, that they haven't provided any AAs in the public domain. So I think, again, I'm just recognizing this is something, I mean, you had actually a relatively few number, but if you look at the number of AAs that industry does, it's a lot more than that. And I think we should make an effort to get some of those factors into this, maybe not in this report, but certainly we need to get that information in. What are the pluses, the minuses, how do you go about it, how do you prioritize? That's all done every day. Most of my phone calls are actually doing just that. So that's one. Green chemistry, I am a chemist. I hate the term green chemist, primarily because I think it's a term that should die quickly. I think any chemist should be very familiar with the green chemistry principles and practice it. So rather than set apart a separate, here, you're a green chemist, but you're a regular chemist, to me, all of that should be factored into becoming a chemist in the first place. So I hate the idea of separating the two. To me, it should be one and the same. To be a chemist, you should be trained in these methods, period. In terms of speeding things up, I think we touched on it yesterday, and I'm not sure where we ended up, but children's sleep pads, if everybody has gotten out of them and there's nobody using them, can't we just find a way to end the process and not waste time with going through the procedures? Obviously, we're going to keep it active, as Carl said, it's still there. But I think why continue to waste time if nobody's using it? We can stop it, and in a way, it's already accomplished a goal of the program. Whoever was in it is now out, but we don't have to waste time and resource continuing on with what is required in the regulations. Is there a way just to stop it, put it on hiatus, put it on a shelf, and keep it there, make sure people are aware of it, but go on to the newer topics?
Ken and Meg.
There were two questions, so I want to make sure I'm separating them. The first question is, did we see something else that wasn't?
Yeah.
And the second one was?
Yeah. So the first one is, do you see something that's not there or have a different view on what was there? And then the second one is about implementation, priorities for implementation, ways of implementing some of the recommendations. So we're on the first one at this point.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I guess.
Oh, I'm sorry. So what I was trying to do was get folks to poke holes in this part of the conversation. So do you see a hole here? Do you see something that you might have brought up that wasn't there? Or do you have a starkly different view? And once we get those out, which looks like it's going to be a pretty small number, then we can move into the second part of the conversation.
Right. Okay, so I'll do that. So one of the things, I listened to your presentation, Gina, with great comfort and enjoyed it very much. And now it's true, I have not been nosing around California business community for a couple of years, but when I was, several years ago, there was a lot of passion about this program and a lot of angst and a lot of feeling like it was too complicated, too slow. It was, interfering. It was all kinds of different things. And we had a lot of presence of the Business Association here testifying to us and elsewhere. When you presented it all, it sounded to me so comfortable. And I just wonder, has the whole California community just settled into something so accepting of this that, or is it really more that Gina Solomon is just such a nice person that you're filtering some of the passion and anger that I initially heard? So I guess that's one point. And the other, you made the point early on, or you continue to nudge at it, and that is there's the issue of what the statute does and what the response to the statute, and there's the issue of what the program does and what the response to the program is. And I'm curious to hear, because I hear them as different, the way people look at the program here and the way they look at the statute. Could you say a word or two about those?
On your first question about the business community, I think that the relatively sanguine, though not fully sanguine, sort of reactions that I got from the business community probably had more to do with selection bias than anything else, in that the selection criteria included having quite a bit of expertise and, understanding of the program. I was looking for people who really know what this program is about, who are either involved in, sort of working on the original legislation or who are very involved now. And many of those people, I think, sort of accept generally the principle of the program and are not actively trying to eliminate it. And I think there is a pretty strong perspective in the business community that the structure for dealing with, chemicals in products is better placed, within the department than in the legislature. And so I think I heard that trade-off of, well, we don't want to go back to the days of having a, slew of ban bills. Was the type of comment that I heard quite a bit from people in the business community. And so I heard even from people who are passionately opposed to individual product listings and who in fact are representing, companies that are, that make some of these products, are saying, it's in the business community's interest to have a program that works. And then a number of people said, the business community supported this legislation. So it's that was the theme. So it may be selection bias. And if I went out there to people in the business community who are not as familiar with the program and who maybe were sort of feeling that tug of being pulled in, I didn't talk, to be honest, like with the spray polyurethane folks. Those people were sort of pulled in and may have a different perspective. And then in terms of the difference between the statute and the program, I didn't ask questions to really tease the two apart. I mean, I did ask questions, obviously, about things that were not directly a part of the Safer Consumer Products Program. In this presentation, other than talking a little bit about 509 and mentioning green chemistry generally, or sort of all that stuff at the end, I didn't emphasize those other pieces as much. Art? Oh, Meredith, do you want to weigh in?
And I would actually make three distinctions. There's the statute, there's the regulation, and there's how we've implemented it. So I would just parse it even further.
Thank you very much. And Gina, that's just an excellent study. It was so informative. And as someone who has been doing this for, again, over 10 years, it was really nice to see you summarizing, the progress and where we can go from here. Just want to touch on a couple of points that Jack made regarding, well, the first one is about the absence of industry AAs on your list. And I was wondering if that's due to the fact that businesses are just reluctant to share that information, or if it's a situation where, in fact, businesses don't do the kind of formal AAs that's part of the SCP program. I mean, we do material selection decisions based on various types of analysis every day, and which is, I think, what Jack was pointing to. But in terms of actually doing formal AAs, I certainly don't do a full-blown AA every time I make a material selection decision. So because of that, it's really hard for me to actually provide, you with an AA in the format that's consistent with what would be done by an NGO or, for regulatory purposes. So that's one comment. And the other comment about, Jack was saying about, in terms of fast tracking, is especially in situations where major companies already have made the switch. And so instead of actually, for my kind of simplistic way of looking at this, instead of then going to not coming or just going directly to a regulatory response, I'm just thinking, doesn't it make a lot more sense to then just not put that on list or go through the process of actually listing it as a priority product? So just.
And I'm going to hop in with, actually, Mike, do you have one having to do with the observations different thing? And Meg, you too?
Mine really small.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll just drop in my little comment here and then move on to Mike, Meg, Helen. So my little one is just that one issue that I'm seeing that's just starting to unfold is the example for MDI, where the industry association has gotten involved and is appealing the regulation. And I'm also seeing that same kind of thing starting on the perfluorinated chemicals. The industry association is clearly very, very heavily involved in this. And I understand that the concern about delays. One of the structuring of the regulations was to try to separate the interests of the chemical manufacturers from the interest of the people who are actually making and selling a product to consumers, and to really focus the program on the people who are making and focusing the product, making the product for consumers, because they can have a choice of chemicals, chemistries, and various things that they're going to do in terms of designing and selling their product. What kind of business are they in, and so on. And what I'm seeing here worries me a little bit in terms of speed of the process. Do we have the structure fully right yet? Do industry associations, should they have the standing to be able to enter the process in the ways that could cause it to be fully delayed? So industry associations functioning as a stakeholder like everyone else, chemical manufacturers and others and all the other people in the world, I really understand. But what standing do they have to pull the process further along, delay it further, is for me a question that we'll probably learn more about as this process unfolds, but it seems something that might be worth examining. So I've got Mike and then Meg, and if you have a comment on this gaps area, I suggest you put your flag up now so that then we can move on to Helen. So I've got Mike, Meg, and Helen. And then if you don't have your flag up at the end of this, I'm going to assume that we should move on to the next question.
So first, I just want to also say I really enjoyed the presentation, and I really thought the excerpts were phenomenal. They brought to life what you were talking about, and you added a lot of wit to them. So thank you for including those. So a thing I was thinking about, one of your slides, you were talking about transparency and confidential business information, and you mentioned that you were looking at regulations other than this one too. It was a whole broad spectrum of green chemistry initiatives that you considered. And I was wondering, in California now, there's the ingredient disclosure initiative that is going full speed ahead, and it's going to potentially give a lot more information on things that are closer. Sorry, I'm normally so loud. So
I can hear you.
Okay, see? But so we've got the California ingredient disclosure requirements that are potentially going to be very mineable for DTSC to look and say, okay, what ingredients are out there being intentionally used? And then there's the New York requirements that are coming to life that go even further than the California. So for a change, California is not in the lead. I think California maybe is more meaningful in some cases, but it's going to be a different subset. And is that something that was looked at in the study and can be then used by DTSC as part of the program, do you think?
Well, the recent legislation on ingredients in cleaning products came up quite a bit. People mentioned it as a model and an example of this sort of concept, that some people termed radical transparency, the idea of just sort of getting more information out to the public. There were a number of folks who talked about that as a potential model for other sectors, and that it should go beyond cleaning products, and maybe that would be something to build on over time. That was sort of the camp who are like, most ingredients in most things should be public, which was one perspective. Then there were others who were saying, well, maybe not go that far, but at least DTSC should be able to get the information, even if they wouldn't be completely public. So that was a different perspective.
Thank you both. Meg, then Helen.
I honestly can't figure out which category my comments fit into, and it's a topic that's been being discussed, so it seemed fair. It's broadly on this issue of a fast track, but I don't think, I'm kind of looking for the reason I'm thinking it falls into the alternative ideas section is because I wanted to kind of reframe it potentially to be about sort of alternative points of access, or like a diversity of points of access, rather than creating like a parallel fast track. But in a way, this is what Gina has highlighted by saying sort of, these are the conditions where, I don't know, we might skip to a regulatory response, or these are the conditions where we might skip to an alternatives assessment. And I wanted to parse those just a little bit because I had thoughts about them. One of the list of 3 things under skip to a regulatory response if a chemical isn't necessary or companies have already switched. And in my mind, I actually think would be like access the regulatory process at alternatives analysis, because the premise of the regulation or of the program is that you don't make switches without considering alternatives. And so if it's not necessary or there are switches happening, you go into the alternatives assessment process, not a regulatory response, because the industry may have switched, but to something that turns out to be hazardous, and that's the whole point of this program and doing it in this way. So I almost feel like those are access points to AA, not to regulatory response. And if there's an acceptable AA, then maybe which is the third point that you had under that, that's an access point to regulatory response, because that's the flow of the program, right, is alternatives analysis, regulatory response. The challenge with as I'm sure everybody is thinking about, if there's an acceptable AA, is we saw in the department's analysis presented yesterday that none of the AAs that were deemed, significant enough to really do a deep investigation into met the criteria for the SCP program, including the one that DTSC commissioned, and granted its goal was not to meet the requirements of the SCP program, but I was asking a little bit about that, but it sounded like mainly it was a budgetary issue might have been, or just not what you needed input about right then. But it makes me wonder if there might be a way to say, well, here's this really good AA that's missing criteria H, L, and P. And so let's focus on fleshing out those parts of the criteria, starting with this, 3/4 done AA, or it doesn't have enough information about functional use and necessity, or we might have a little difference with how the performance criteria were defined, which was the kind of the issues I was highlighting yesterday, is how broad how much people might differ in how they define level of necessary performance to be an acceptable alternative. So I'm interested in what Carl has said and Meredith both about how much exchange they hope to have with responsible entities during the alternatives assessment process, and how engaged they hope that process will be. And I wonder if there's a way to enshrine that, maybe in the implementation process, we're not talking about changing statute. it seems like statutory changes would be required for different points of access. But at least as an interim measure, to make that AA process somehow enshrine in the implementation, and I'm like getting pretty foggy about how this would look, but that interactive process so that you have the opportunity to say, look, there's this model AA that already does, in our view, good work in these areas, and what's lacking is this. Or, we don't see any definition of functional use here and it needs that, whatever, that there could be a slightly more formalized process for that that's in the hands of the department and then implementation's choice. That might at least be a step. It doesn't change the statutory requirements and doesn't establish a new point of access, which is one of the other suggestions that I think I'm making, but maybe there's a range of ways of starting to get at the point of that. The second category that Gina had was skip to the AA if the legislature wants action on a chemical. I guess what I'm doing is kind of rolling up everything into, there's only one, there's this alternative thing of go to AA, and my question for the department is, so that would subvert the process of refining the priority product that I've heard the department staff talk about as a useful process for at least these first priority products. There were changes that were made to the spray polyurethane foam priority product that were pretty critical. The fact of designating the priority product, I get the sense, brings interested parties to the table and starts some conversations and makes information available to the department that might not have been available beforehand. And so I just was wondering if staff might reflect a little bit on what it would mean to skip that process and whether that's something you might consider as you build experience with it, right? Like these first few cases were really high learning curve for the department. But if there are, if that seems like a possibility, or if that would be missing a really important phase of kind of fleshing out the priority product understanding.
So, as we transition to Meredith to answer this question, I think this whole topic that Meg's starting on is actually one that we need to discuss. So I want to, after.
Then why don't we do?
Yeah, so Helen's been waiting for a while, so I'm thinking of that, and then let's have a little chat about this. The other topic where I think we really need to have a chat is other ways of streamlining the process, and streamlining seems to be a really important theme here. So I want to make sure we get those as part of our implementation discussion. But let's let Helen go.
I wanted to go back to the methodological framing at the beginning of this being a qualitative versus a quantitative. I really like the fact that it's rich, and I like the quotes and so on. And it starts to raise the question, though, of is this, to Tim's point, is this sort of just a consensus of how it's perceived by a very knowledgeable community, but not necessarily indicating how the actual outcome or the success is? Right. So is this groupthink? Are we all just sort of patting ourselves on the back? And we do have a couple of different ways that we're looking at the success, right? So we've got the internal focus benchmark oversight that the program has. We've got a little bit of market monitoring that's, we're starting to see. But so my question might be to you is there some other hard outcome-based monitoring or study that we want to recommend in addition to these three, the qualitative, the internally focused, and the market monitoring, to just be like, are the regulations meeting the actual outcome goals? Not are we able to turn the crank, but are we actually getting that public health impact that the original legislation intended? And so that would be a question is there something missing or something that we want to add to that on the outcome and quantitative as opposed to qualitative?
And I want to thank all of you for your comments on the gaps, because it's both reinforcing that a lot of stuff was covered and providing, as we should, some new thoughts. So I'll turn this over to Meredith, and maybe you can respond to Meg and help us a little bit with this discussion of the potential for the fast track option that Gina's asked us to respond to.
And I think Carl and I are going to tag team this. In terms of the actual value and process of going through prioritization, listing a product, developing the technical document, et cetera, yes, it definitely leads to engagement, but I think that hasn't really been a problem for us, except for in one area. I'll call it out, which is of all the different products we've mentioned, we've had good engagement from, the nail salon products manufacturers, from the perfluorinated chemicals manufacturers, et cetera. The one area I would say is the care and treatment products for the PFAS. When we had that workshop, none of them showed up. And so in general, I think that because because we're California, I don't know why, we do get engagement. And so I don't know that that process is what drives that engagement. And then I will also say that in terms of what we've done in terms of the technical documentation, I think it is appropriate for us to take a step back and figure out how much of that is needed. So let me give you an example, and I'll be pretty explicit about it, which my staff will probably kill me for. So in the nonylphenol ethoxylates case, our primary fundamental concern about nonylphenol ethoxylates in laundry detergents is aquatic toxicity. However, there's some, it's a human endocrine disruptor too. How much time do we need to invest in addressing that when our primary concern is aquatic toxicity? And trying to find that sweet spot has been a challenge for us. And so I do think that there are things that even we could do on our end to stay focused, perhaps. We've set a pretty high bar for ourselves in terms of the technical documentation, and I don't know, and I think it's incredibly important for the robustness and the legal defensibility, et cetera, and circumventing that could lead to problems in terms of making sure. I mean, there's a scientific peer review built into our process. What happens to that if we circumvent that step?
Can I ask another question related to that?
Yes.
One of the things that we heard about in public comment yesterday, and that is echoed by Gina's work, is this tension that's developing between the legislature handing everything over to the Safer Consumer Products Program versus should they still be taking action. And that was something that came up in this work. And I guess that's one of the things that I'm asking is, I don't know if you can offer an opinion about this, but what if the legislature, so my personal opinion is that the limitations on the SCP program as it currently exists are sufficient that for the legislature to completely let go of their responsibility makes the whole state's effort on toxics too small, too limited. So that's just my opinion about that. And so given that, if I still want the legislature to take action, but I want it to take action within the context of the SCP program, the way that I envision that is they would take some action and say, require companies to do an alternatives assessment on this. So they would essentially pick something that would mean you didn't do your priority product designation process. So you've just talked really usefully, which I really appreciate, about ways to kind of speed your prioritization process, and that some of the maybe timelines and the public process haven't been the key to their utility, to that process's utility. But I guess I'm asking also another question of like the impacts of skipping that process entirely for something that the legislature wants to take action on.
I would say that it could be appropriate for the legislature to do that and to But one of the things that perhaps they should task the department with is, for instance, doing a conceptual model about giving the manufacturers some kind of starting point, some kind of set of parameters for doing that alternatives analysis. I mean, one of the things that happens as a result of our rulemaking is we identify hazards that need to be considered. We give them a starting point for trying to identify those relevant factors. And I still think that that's going to, given the scope of the AA, they need to have some starting point. And I would probably suggest that something along those lines needs to be included.
I'll just briefly add to that, and I'll address your first point comment, is that I think it's important to understand that we hear often from industry and everyone, they want certainty. And what we're dealing with often is lack of information, data, and uncertainties. But the cornerstone of our framework is the AA process, and this process is very different from other regulatory approaches. So part of the question and challenge is that as scientists, we want answers too. We want to be confident that we're moving forward based on enough information to go to the next step. And we've raised that bar fairly high. It creates discomfort for many people to get there because there's an expectation by many that before we get to an AA that we have to prove that there's a problem. And many people are also thinking that we're going to know where it's going to end up. And we're constantly saying, look, we have enough here to ask the question and to move this forward. We're not predetermining the outcome or any regulatory response. So that's a cultural thing that I think is a good question and perspective to keep in mind as we say, how do we make decisions that might accelerate this, and what does the framework look like? On your first question about the engagement, or skipping, and what did we expect in terms of engagement in the AA process that would be helpful? Yes, it clearly still is our hope that as we get into that process, that we will actually have real world examples that will be public on a variety of fronts. How do you deal with uncertainty? How do you make decisions in that context? How do you address Helen's issue of how do you evaluate relevant factors through this long list of potential things you need to consider? How do you go about that and document that and put that in an AA? And obviously depends on the product, and within each category, within each priority product, there's going to be a variety of perspectives. So we were very gratified to hear your input yesterday that we've done a lot to set up these general frameworks and guidance things. The devil's in the details, let's get on with it. That was our hope, and still is our hope, that will be in the process, generating examples, case studies, real world examples, highlighting where we can focus our issues and our resources to better address really key things that need to be addressed rather than the whole enchilada. So it's going to be very important whether it's methylene chloride, SPF, or the next one in line, and they all will have their own challenges. But I think that's where we'll get some certainty because people will see the department's decision-making around that AA, which will then give some people some comfort in terms of how we're implementing our regulations and the mandates in the law. So it's very important.
So I'd like to ask a follow-up to this. We're talking about in the context of AA, but I know of at least one example where departments kind of thinking the AA isn't the best process. It's the lead and fishing weights. And I'm wondering if you could remark on that kind of thing. And when I say the department thinks the AA isn't the best process, part of that is because the department is keenly aware of the alternatives that are available and in some sense has already gone through the thought process of the AA on that.
It does make me want to step back and channel Debbie Raffel, who was very clear about this as the regs were being adopted, that there will still be a very important role for the legislature. And we think that's the case. I think our concern has been with the program at its infancy, we can answer this question with much more intelligence now than we could have 3 years ago. And we have a better idea of where that appropriate leverage point for the legislature could be. But with the lead and fishing weights example, lead is bad. Lead is ending up in the environment as a result of fishing. There's no doubt about exposure. It's pretty well established. There are alternatives. You don't need to do an alternatives analysis. They're already on the market, right? And So for us to spend our precious few resources going through the reg process and getting to the alternatives analysis didn't seem like the best use of our resources. That said, I think we would be happy if those alternatives were being pursued more aggressively.
So we've got a few minutes before the break, and I know Anne has been patiently waiting, and so has Tim just started, so we'll see how far we can get before a break.
Thank you. I've been sitting here kind of struggling and maybe backing up and saying, all right, what problem are we trying to solve, and is this the place to solve it? So thank you, Meredith. You kind of led me down that road. Is that my understanding is the perception is that there are bad actor chemicals out there that we don't necessarily want to have to spend DTSC's resources on because it's so obvious, but then that means that we're not really applying a standard. So what standard should we apply in that context to decide that it's a bad actor? Who makes that decision? Who manages that process? And I think there may be cases, and I don't really know how to test this, but there may be cases, and you know, that these other cases like this have been brought to the legislature for an out-and-out ban, and the legislature has been punting it to SCP. And I don't think that's appropriate, but I'm not quite sure how to navigate how to solve that problem. It seems to me that these bad actors, clear bad actors with ready alternatives, the lead fishing weights, where do those fit? We don't want to let them drop off, but I totally understand that in the prioritization of this program, they don't belong here either. So I think that's what I'm sitting with, is how do we, that's a fast track that didn't come up in your discussions. I mean, Meg, you framed this beautifully, the diversity of points of access, for when it's clear, when something's not necessary, it's already phased out, alternatives are readily available, or an alternative assessment exists that could be readily used with some adjustment, but we still have this bad actor fast track that we haven't really dealt with. And so that's, I think I'm just leaving us with a question of how do we cope with that?
All right, on fast track options, Tim?
So I just want to say 4 things. Okay, so on the pace of the program, thank you. On the pace of the program question on prioritization, I think that's definitely worth looking at. I saw you had a suggestion, maybe this is the body to look at that. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe with like some background work being done first and then we talk about it. I agree with Helen. I think it's really important to look at the actual on-the-ground dynamics that are happening. People have their perceptions, and I may or may not agree with them, but when it comes time to actually evaluate a program, I think you got to like dig in and see what happened in these instances and what are our metrics for success or not successful, as opposed to, okay, so I think that's worth looking into. On terms of the faster track, and particularly, I think Jack brought it up originally yesterday, and it's so resonant today about this question about when it's obvious, like the fishing weights or where people aren't doing it anymore. I think that makes sense to have a weigh in, and I agree with Helen again. This is like a great day. I agree with Helen again that for the older people on the group, in the sense of like how long the group's been there were extensive back and forth about this early on, and a fast track didn't end up in the regs. I think it makes sense to have such a thing in these instances, and I think a simple change to the regs, that's certainly within the department's authority. The statute doesn't require that it be set up to have the manufacturers doing AAs. That was a decision. The statute says there needs to be an AA, and the department could do that. So it would be, when you look at the regs, how they're written, you might even be able to read them creatively to allow the department to do an AA and do a regulatory response, but it'd be very creative. But it'd be fairly simple for the department to make a change to the regs, just give them the ability to do an AA, and at that point they could go ahead and then move on to a regulatory response. I don't know, like when you said in the lead weight thing, we don't need to do an AA, I think what you really meant was we don't need to do the kind of AA that everybody is picturing under these regs, right? I think you do need to do a thoughtful analysis, pull all that stuff together, support a regulatory decision. I think that's what you mean. You don't need to do, and I agree with that. And so, you know, maybe you could do that sort of thing. So I would suggest looking at that, and right, there is another way of doing fast track, which is like this example, where there's clear alternatives, you've already made a determination that this is a problem and some act, maybe you could work with some of your partner agencies, like the California Department of Public Health has authority under the Hazardous Substances Act to take action with respect to chemicals, hazardous materials when it's been determined that they're a problem. They don't use that very much, but that's certainly already a provision, and it seems to me, I guess I don't get to talk anymore today. All right, so anyway, okay, changing the AA process, all the complaints about AA. I mean, I do kind of feel like it is overblown in the sense of, somebody here already said, we haven't done one yet. So was that you, Mike? So how do we know there's really a problem with them? I think in part it's because, and maybe we all share some blame here, I've heard various people on this panel and earlier on who talked about how much has to be in an AA, and people were being cautious and didn't want to talk about how limited it might be, So I think before we go back and start changing the AA process, because there were so many conversations about it, let's get some in and then go back. Like on the prioritization, we've done some, we know there might be problems, now let's go back and look at. On the AA, we haven't done any yet, none have come in. So this is all hypothetical, and I think it's worthwhile to maybe step back and wait on that one. And then lastly, on funding, which was brought up, that seems to me also to be worthwhile to look at. But I think that really needs some serious analysis in terms of like, how does the spending happen? What is it the money spent on? How could it be supplemented? There's been lots of conversations about that, and I liked the provision in here that said maybe what they ought to do is fund a study to think about the long-term sustainability of this, as opposed to kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the funding problem. That's it.
Jack promises 1 minute. Oh, you're taking it, okay.
I'll talk after.
Yeah, so why don't it's break time, and I'd suggest we take a break. When we'll end that break at 1:45, and I will be looking for derrieres in chairs at that time. And Tim can get us time between now and then so he can talk again. And when we come back, let's focus on implementation, so of the recommendations, some thoughts about how we might proceed in that. A couple of things we might want to talk about is a little more about the streamlining ideas in particular, but I think also we should open the conversation more broadly in that regard. And we might consider whether there are specific issues where the panel might be able to advise the department. So I'm sensing that need to dig down into some of these recommendations and some more practicalities. And the department may end up wanting to come to the panel to get some advice on some of that. So thanks. All right, I'm calling this meeting back to order of the Green Ribbon Science Panel so we can continue our discussion we've been really focusing on implementation of some of the recommendations or topics that have come out here, and among those, the issue of potential streamlining of getting to regulatory response or getting to AA. And I'm looking for folks who want to comment in this area, and Ken Geiser is the first one up.
Okay, so this is part of a discussion, as I understand it, so I can be more discussive. So I think one of the things that struck me listening to Gina was I was reflecting back on the history of the TORA program, and it turns out, as I remember, in the 7th year of the program, we did a evaluation of the program, brought a lot of people together and took a look at what was strong, what was not working, what wasn't working. And one of the big things was there was concern and complaint about the amount of time it was taking to do the plans, which are a sort of a modified or more primitive version of the alternative assessments that we're talking about today, and also the complexities. And we also were recognizing, because we had a requirement that not only did people have to do these plans, these alternative assessments, but they had to update them every 2 years. So this was something that was a lot of ongoing work. And we decided we needed to streamline the program, or at least streamline the framework for doing this. So it seems like that as we sit here today, 10 years into the program, it was about the point that with the TORA program, we moved toward a streamlining, and we dropped some of the framework and changed the way people could report. And some of that had to do, if nothing had changed, there was a simpler way to report and things like that, that we did try to work out. So in my mind, it is a good time to think about it, and Gina's report or survey and all, I think provides some interesting material for possibly doing that. And I would maybe encourage the program, the department and all, to begin to think about that, particularly given the political context of new governors and all that kind of thing like that might be a useful thing to think about. Of course, Tim's point is well taken, and that is, hard to reconsider the alternative assessment protocol when we really haven't done an alternative assessment yet. But on the other hand, Gina's report, I thought at the top of it was that pretty interesting slide in which she said, well, actually there have been, people say there have been effects. They, that already they've changed out of certain chemicals and taken a look at their chemicals they were using, and alternatives will largely be either because they're on it as a candidate, they're as a potential candidate, or other things may have driven people to do that, to begin to shift chemicals in their products. And given the way I tend to think about the success of the program, it really is dependent on the issue, do we change the market? Do we shift chemicals in the market and make products safer? Should be sort of an outer goal of the safer consumer products part of the green chemistry program. I think that one way to think about streamlining a bit, if you don't mind, is that maybe we should spend more time in that early area where the department decides, as you do today, that you're thinking about a particular product prioritization, that you really do call in all of the major producers of that and ask for the information you need and get dialogue going on about it in the way that I think you've done with the nail salon folks, if I understood, and that indeed tests a bit to see how much changes even just from that, and take a look at what the impact of bringing together competitors in a room to talk about what alternatives may be on the market and what is actually possible, and then to watch, maybe you do it a couple of times, and it's all within the framework of getting ready to do this designation, this rulemaking, which would lead to a prioritized chemical. And it almost makes the alternative process the stick that drives the changes before you need to really drive the changes. And it turns the question in an interesting way and really looks to the leadership of firms. Again, I think of firms who use chemicals, not firms who make chemicals, but firms who use chemicals to their own innovative capacity to change, and then call that part of the program in a very proud and decent and happy way, and say, this is some of the effects that we're seeing, and in some way, it pushes all what the regulatory body of the program off to. You can always call upon it if you don't feel like things are moving fast enough, but it becomes a kind of an interesting way to think about it. The last thing I do, just thank you to Gina for remembering that the program really had 6 elements, the green chemistry program, and that I applaud you and really just to you, hope you do say something about green chemistry education. And even though Jack doesn't want us to use the word green chemistry, I think he's on the right theme, that all chemistry should be green, or all young chemists should know about toxicology and environmental fate and transport and et cetera. So please punch that out. For those of us who think of ourselves still as faculty, it's really important. Thank you.
So as I pass this to Meg Jack and Helen, I'll note, just as an add-on to Ken's comment about the idea of keeping the stick in the back pocket and having those initial conversations without actually holding the stick in the air. My experience is that industries often, after they make that voluntary change, really want the regulatory floor to keep out alternatives. And that goes to Gina's point about is there some way to streamline that once there's been a major industry change and we're just trying to get the last few players. So we'll just go right around here, starting with Meg.
Thanks. I had one other thought about this diversity of access points, and it's more of a question about what happens when what the department described happened with the flame retardants in sleep mats, in nap mats, happens, which is that nobody declared they're continuing to use the chemicals, and therefore the process will not produce AAs, and therefore there's no obvious path to a regulatory response. And does the department lose all its levers at that point? And what can be done next? Because at that point, we've kind of missed the intent of the regulation. At least, correct me if I'm not seeing this right, if there's something else happening that you think is beneficial. So we got out of a couple of hazardous chemicals in the nap mats, but I don't know what's being used. It sounds like through the XRF work that research that you're doing, you're getting some idea of what's being used, but that change was made in absence of the AA process. Now, we know because of the regulation that they didn't at least change to another candidate chemical, because that's prohibited without alerting the department, if I remember the regulation correctly. No.
There's a timing issue, right? It's the day the regulations became effective. If they made that switch before the regs became effective, they could have gone to another candidate chemical. And I would say that based on the preliminary work, some did do that switch.
Which, as a separate point, points again toward the need for a class-based approach, because a class-based approach is what would prevent that.
Which we couldn't do in the first round of products.
Right. So, not that you did it wrong, but just to
I'm just
support
saying,
the PFAS work.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, as further support for that. Anyway, it's something that I didn't know about until you told us about it yesterday, and I'm interested to think about the implications for that, for this question of the diversity of access points. And is there a way to take another swing through nap mats that now consider, you're saying, yes, there is.
Yeah, I actually have thought, again, I'll probably get killed by staff for this, thought that we should have a trailer in our work plan saying we can follow up on any previous priority product, period,
Yeah.
and just make sure that's the case. This is my chance to say, I consider the nap mats pretty successful in terms of actually getting to the point, which is a safer product. The vast majority of products that we looked at don't have any flame retardants. So bully for that, and in some cases, I don't feel like we need to get to that regulatory response. If we continued to see a whole series of flame retardants, then I would feel more sense of urgency about it. But in this case, I do think there won't be flame retardants in these products.
Do they have no flame retardants or no halogenated flame retardants?
No, yeah, it's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another topic, that's okay. But then the main thing that I wanted to raise was kind of to return to Helen's point about measuring the public health impact of the regulation, because it's sort of the holy grail, right? Is like why this was created, and is it doing what it's doing beyond our assessment of how we think it's working. And I wanted to offer just a little bit of reflection on that based on some other research that I'm currently doing, which is asking the same question about Prop 65, everybody's favorite chemical policy to hate on. And we're asking multiple kinds of questions to try to elucidate the impact of Prop 65 on Californians' exposure to chemicals that are on the Prop 65 list. And we're looking at a subset of breast cancer-related chemicals and endocrine disruptors. And there's the impact of enforcement, which is easier to look at, and the harder one that I find much more interesting is the impact of listing. And that's a parallel to the SCP program, because there's the candidate chemical list and the work plan, which are intentionally, I believe, broad, are meant to kind of open the opportunity to look in a lot of places. And then there's the small number of priority products that are going to have specific actions and enforcement actions and all of that. So there's kind of that parallel, and we are doing backflips to try to understand these sort of indirect impacts, the impacts of listing. And we're looking at things like other regulations that echo the Prop 65 list and use it as a source of chemicals of concern, particularly Prop 65, just to show our cards a little bit. Some of the things that we're finding are that Prop 65's definition of reproductive toxicants seems to be particularly useful, because there aren't a lot of authoritative lists about reproductive toxicants. So that shows up in, for example, Green Seal standards, covering about 1,200 different products that are certified under Green Seal now. That guarantees that they won't have a reproductive toxicant listed under Prop 65 in them. But all of these, the reason I give this detail is because we're having to do this sort of circuitous inquiry to try to sort of get at what some of these impacts are, but we don't actually know how product formulations have changed. And that's what we really want to know. We want to know how product formulations have changed, how environmental levels may have changed, and how human exposures have changed. And those are the expensive things to measure, and/or the confidential business information, no legal access to that information. That is, the product formulation information is very hard to get for anybody besides the people who make it, and the environmental and biomonitoring information is expensive to get. But ideally, I think it's worth thinking about is how could one get the information you really want about the impact of the regulation, and whether it's, I know there's some links with Biomonitoring California, and Biomonitoring California, which I can say because I chair that scientific guidance panel, is interested in intervention studies where you look at removing a chemical in a product from a person's environment and see how it affects levels in them. So there's potential for overlap, but I think it's worth thinking about, especially in relationship to this assessment project, which could then say, you know, we're having to feel around the edges of the impact of this, and a more direct way of measuring it would be X, Y, or Z. It returns to some of the themes that have come up in Gina's research about inability to access sort of firsthand product ingredient information, and how formulations have changed. One of the things that we're drawing on for the Prop 65 project is Carb consumer product surveys, but there's again a circuitous, you have to make some assumptions about CAS numbers in products and then product categories to start, because Carb just presents product categories and sales volumes for that. So it's all very, and I know the department's familiar with those data and is working with them. What I'm basically saying is that with the data that are currently available to us, we have to pull together such a patchwork of information to try to glean any feedback about the impact of these regulations, that if one were really wanting to do this in a more informed way, one would set up different programs. And that we could make that suggestion to the legislature, et cetera.
Thanks, Meg. Jack, then Helen, then Ann.
I just want to follow on what Ken was talking about and also comment on art. I was involved in AB 1879 way back when. I just want to remind everybody that industry by and large supported it, in part because I remember going through the A through M and saying we do this already for the most part. I'm not going to say every company does it. But when we do an AA within the industry, let's face it, most of those factors don't change from the current product to the one we're considering maybe without the chemical. So most of them, if they don't change, we don't address them. We only focus on the ones that will change. When you're doing an external AA, such as we saw on the screen, they don't have that. They start from ground zero for everything. So they actually have to address all A through M, where in fact industry doesn't really have to within our very targeted, focused alternative assessments. But that information is, I mean, we have the information, but when you're looking at changing a formula, if nothing changes, we're not going to go through and analyze it again. And that does include, by the way, a lot of the socioeconomic factors too. So we know a lot of this anyway. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, AB 1879 was supported by industry because it was very comprehensive and did do a lot of the things that we currently do anyway. And I don't think that's changed in the 10 years since. Senate Bill 258, we've already mentioned. Again, for the most part, and I know there's a few exceptions, industry came out and supported that as well. In my case, it was easy because most of it mirrored what my product line already did, which is disclose all the ingredients, both online and on label. There's a few changes, but again, we came out and supported it along with most of our trade association colleagues. So again, I think if you look at it from that point of view, a lot of the information is getting out there in a better way than it ever has. It may not be in every consumer product case, that may not be true, but it's getting there. So again, I just encourage everybody involved, and Meredith, you and Carl, you've already talked to it. People are willing to talk under certain conditions, and I think it's getting better. And especially if you look at it, some industries are probably a lot better than others.
All right, thanks, Jack. Helen Ann. Oh, I'm sorry.
On the observation that companies were just getting out of things, out of chemicals before dates, before triggering dates. You know, we did actually talk about this quite extensively in the original regs. And in fact, what we had proposed, or some of us had proposed, was to codify it, knowing that this was going to happen, put a constraint that if you changed, if your replacement was not on the list, that it was simply a notification. And there was definitely some support for it, but not quite enough because, again, the more progressive voices through all of the different stakeholders kept wanting to hold the highest standard to every decision that was being made. But we fully anticipated that companies were going to do what they're doing now. I mean, this is not an unforeseen situation. So that would just be something, an idea to revisit. Is there a tweak, a modification to bring back that it's a very minor change in some ways, but it at least keeps kind of the worst offenders or the worst changes, the worst regrettable choices to be made. At least you're sure that it's not another chemical of concern. It may not have a full assessment, but is that if they're going to do that anyway, because of, like you said, they could today, if they changed before the date, they can use anything else on the list. And I don't think anybody really wants that. So, you know, this is something. So that kind of leads me into this question, or I don't know, just raising the question. One of the things I like about some of the European, some of the European Commission's initiatives and regulations and laws is that they have a date that forces them to re-examine it. And I'm wondering if it might make some sense to set a target date, to go back in and with a set of goals to fine-tune things. And I know that's really scary, and you know, because we know how hard this is, but it's healthy, at least in the versions that I've seen in the EU, because things that are working get improved, things that aren't working get fixed. It does, although it's hard, it actually has resulted, I think, in more robust and better programs.
Thanks. Go ahead, Meredith.
Sorry. I would say that is true, and it has also, in some cases, created that opportunity for mischief. So there have been cases in the EU where that revisiting of a regulatory framework creates an opportunity for people to retrench and to take a step back from the original intent of the regulation. And that has not happened just once. It's happened on a couple of occasions, and including the last year or two. And it's
So do you think that the risk is so high of that in this case that we couldn't have some
No,
sort of goal like that?
I just think you have to go into it eyes wide open.
Oh, sure.
That you open up the framework, either the regulations or the statute, and it can go wherever it goes. And but that's a risk, and it's the way it is. But I do think, I agree with you, that the European framework of periodic reviews of all of their regulations is really powerful. I mean, let me just say, as the department, we have stuff on the books that's completely irrelevant now. And we don't have a mechanism to systematically get it off the books. We have authorities, and somebody can always point to the department and say, you're not doing X, Y, and Z. And then you have to have a conversation about why we shouldn't be.
Right, I've got Anne. I'm going to drop in somewhere in here, and then we can still have more follow-up, and I want to encourage those who haven't said anything about implementation or other thoughts they have on any of these regs or questions to start thinking about that. We've got about half an hour. Oh, do you want to do a quick follow-up? Do you mind?
That was just a tiny follow-on to what Meredith said of I appreciate this tension so much about revision versus reopening, and I just don't want to get too sanguine. We have progressive industries here who are already doing ingredient disclosure, and we have a federal bill to completely undermine all labeling and disclosure requirements, including, preempting Prop 65 and stuff. So I don't want to get too sanguine.
Sorry, but let's just take TSCA, right? TSCA got reopened. It got improved in many, many ways, but now there's a preemption provision that never existed there before.
So many things I'm biting my tongue on right now. I'm trying to stay on the topic at hand. But yes, I mean, many, many cocktails could be imbibed, and further conversation could be continued on that. So I wanted to pick up on several themes that I've been hearing, and I think it's around the measuring impact, so it's not strictly streamlining, and then I'll say a quick thing about streamlining. So I was building off Helen's original comment, like Tim, I'm having a wonderful day where I'm echoing Helen, about your outcome measurement and, the ongoing challenge that many of us in the room have talked about for decades, which is how do you measure prevention? Prevention isn't sexy, it's hard to get money for because it's really hard to show the impact you've had. And Meg, thank you very much for your comments about Prop 65 and all the indirect ways you're trying to piece that information together. I think it would behoove us to think about how could we measure that better going forward? And then building also on Ken's comment about just owning the fact that, it was our intention when we put the candidate chemical, the royal we, put the candidate chemical list out there, that our intention was to do exactly what's happened. So how do we start measuring that? And then the layer I wanted to add on to that is to pull in the idea about funding, is that if we can put some money and around that and outcome measures on it and say, these are the public health outcomes that we have achieved with this program, we need better measures, but here's what we've got given the data that we have, then you've got an ROI kind of argument about how much funding you've spent on this program and how much more resource we would like and how much more we could do to protect the health of Californians and, when we really shift the market, the rest of the country and around the world. So that's the piece about measuring impacts and how we could bring that back around to bring more resource to this effort. A thing about streamlining that I think is kind of leading into the prioritization discussion. I'd just like to point out that I think some streamlining is happening as we've gone through a couple of iterations of this program, and I'm speaking on behalf of staff, you guys feel free to kick me if I'm misstating this. But after a couple of rounds of this work plan planning, these criteria are emerging, right? Your prioritization criteria are emerging, you're getting to test them against real world examples. And so I think that may actually will speed us up a little bit moving forward. That said, I think it would be really helpful for this panel to look at prioritization. Many of us work in other areas where we've worked on different kinds of prioritization in similar spaces. So for example, I'm with the Cancer-Free Economy Network. We've gone through a particular lens of focusing on classes of chemicals across different sectors to focus on. in this case, the lens of carcinogenicity. So maybe a way to do that is to not bring all of that to the panel per se, but have a little pre-digestion, suggestions from the panel of other prioritization mechanisms to look at that could inform the discussion about prioritization here. And then finally, since I've got the tiny microphone in front of me, also a plug for green chemistry education, and thank you. I'm one of the few that also remember that there were 6 planks of this in the Green Chemistry Initiative all these years ago. We do have a partner in the state, and Meg, I'm going to jump the gun here, but in the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry, we have a ready candidate for supporting green chemistry education and business and industry partnerships scalable model that Meg has been core in creating.
Great. So I'm going to step in with a few of my own comments here and then go back to encouraging those who haven't spoken and other kinds of comments in this last half hour that we have. First, I'm glad that Ann mentioned funding. I think funding is a really big challenge here. And I just want to clarify with Meredith, I understand you got 6 new positions authorized, but how many total positions does the program have?
So if, including Meredith on down and all of our support staff, we will have 41 positions in Meredith's organization. And we have some support from other organizations and departments, certainly in legal and our colleagues in HERO, our Health, Human and Environmental Risk Office and communications. But our core staff of scientists and engineers is about 28 folks.
That's a really tiny staff to get very much done. And the size of DTSC is? 1,000. 1,000 employees. Okay, so just to give a scale to how small this program is, that I think Elaine said this morning has been a transformative force on the international scale. That's a really tiny program to get very much done, and it does much more than list products and do AAs. There's a lot of other pieces to this program. So it seems to me that absolutely the bottom line fundamental, if we want this program to get more done, it needs a lot more resources. So, and the recommendations include funding that would not go to the department staff for other kinds of supportive programs. And that is also really important. There is no ongoing research arm, for example. That's essential. One-time things just aren't going to make it. I think that's pretty clear. The second comment I want to make is about getting from the work plan and identifying a product chemical combination. It takes years to get to the actual implementation, and during that time we're seeing some of these substitutions that can happen that maybe that's good, maybe that's not good, a lot of on both sides there. But what I'm seeing is a huge part of that is the requirement that I think nobody was anticipating, to have to do an individual regulation and go through that process. So that means once the department has a dialogue, gets all the scientific information together, really frames out what the product is, then there's another year or two before you get all the way through a set of paperwork. And in a lot of ways, that's redundant to what happened earlier, but at the same time, you can't start the regulations very effectively if you don't have those initial scientific conversations and really hone in on what the perfect product chemical combination is to regulate. So it just seems to me that's an area for exploration as to whether there are alternatives to reduce that from, say, 3 years to, say, 1 year. Would make a lot more sense. And that would also reduce the costs, freeing up resources to do other things, so that the dollar per listing is high. And I know the department's working really hard on figuring out how to streamline its processes. It's learned a lot from its initial work, and so that's not a criticism, but more one recognizing that that's a huge time and cost investment that doesn't necessarily bring that much additional benefit to the state of California, but there are certain pieces in that regulatory process that would be lost that might be important. So how can this be handled? My third comment is about data call-in. We've all been circling around the data call-in. There's a data call-in recommendation. And it seems to me that's a really important authority here in a bunch of different ways. It's part of me thinks that once something's listed in the work plan, that there ought to be the department's ability to do a data call-in for all of the chemicals that are on the priority chemicals list in the products that are in the work plan. Now, that might be just way too much data to manage. So that's, and there's a lot of people would be concerned about being in the work plan and even having those conversations. There is also sometimes, I think, the need to figure out what the source is of a pollutant. So before you even get to the work plan, Becky's work has revealed perfluorinated chemicals as an example all through the environment. Where are some of these specific chemicals and their precursors used? And we have some information on that, but perhaps not all the information that we would like. And that allows each product to say, oh, we're not the big one. So, but we really don't really know all the places that some of these chemicals are being used, and there needs to be some way to require some kind of reporting there that is not too onerous. And then the third area is once there's been regulation in a product or the department's acted in an area, it sure would be nice to have some kind of periodic reporting process to be able to see the effect of that. And exactly what that reporting is would really need to be linked to that specific product chemical combination. But as Meg suggested, just getting formulation information about products at some level for some list of chemicals, say those on the priority chemicals list, would be really helpful in assessing the effectiveness of the program. Most of the time people think about data column, they think about issuing a regulation, and I'll point out that that isn't always the case. So for example, under the Clean Water Act and in California law, there's an ability to issue, they always call it a 13267 letter, which is a section in the code, but basically the board can make a decision to require a discharger to provide data. And that is an administrative process that has a high level of approval. The board has to vote on that on that requirement. But once that occurs, the data can be required to be reported. So, and I would also point out that Washington State has worked with others to establish an online database system to provide for reporting on some of this data. And so I'm sure California's been probably even involved in this, but it seems that there are opportunities for streamlining this on the part of manufacturers to minimize how onerous the reporting process might be in a data column system. So I appreciate you all letting me say a few things here, and want to move back to discussion again. I'm not seeing any, so no one else has anything else to say? Yeah. And before we finish up, I would like to let Gina in if she'd like to say a few things or ask any additional questions. So I've got Mark and Becky, and I really want to lean on anybody who hasn't said anything to think about whether or not they have any thoughts.
So first an observation, if you think about it, there's so many products that could be acted on, in this framework, that picking any is kind of a fast track decision. But I was wondering, actually it's for Gina for a question, in the interviews that you conducted for the people who, said that there should be a fast track mechanism, were there any specific criteria offered as to which ones, how you would decide which particular, let's say, the agency, if it had the authority, how it would decide which one should leap straight to the alternatives assessment stage? You don't want to skip that, so let's say you're going to skip the preliminary stages. How you would decide which ones would deserve that sort of fast track approach?
Well, some of the types of quotes are actually on this slide, though I had to shorten them a fair amount to fit. And I have actually quite a few more that will be in the report showing sort of different approaches that were suggested. But, the one perspective was the quote of, if you can get that razzle-dazzle effect and some other, without, the chemical, or if you don't need that razzle-dazzle effect at all in a product for its function, then, those would be candidates for sort of skipping. And I'm actually chewing over, Meg, one of the comments that you made where you were proposing that some things might skip to the AA versus other things that would skip all the way to a regulatory response. So I thought that was kind of intriguing. I'm going to be thinking more about that because in a lot of cases, the people I spoke with were just sort of saying, well, is there, maybe we can just kind of skip, move forward more quickly in certain cases, but they weren't very specific about which phase of the process could be skipped. The pre-regulatory, the initial reg, the AA, the regulatory response, they'd sort of sometimes bundled that. So I'm trying to now tease those threads apart and think about more concretely what could work, which is why this conversation is so useful.
I'll just make an observation that I don't think that well, of course, the razzle-dazzle thing sounds nice, but, I mean, you really have to get down, in the end, to specifics. And so, like, a central question would be, would you want to act on, fast track those things that have more immediate effects, like methylene chloride, which are not going to kill people. Now, how many people is it going to kill? Well, okay, it's not going to kill that many, okay, but they're going to be some deaths. Or would you spend your time on some broad-based population exposure, which will end up with an increased cancer risk over the broad population? Well, they're not going to happen tomorrow, and they're not going to happen next year, but they'll happen down the road. So, I mean, that's the kind of trade-off I'm thinking about in terms of fast-tracking something, that you have to sort of think about the general population exposed, and when you're going to see these toxic effects and what they are, And so I don't think it's an easy decision-making process.
I just had a couple comments. I liked Kelly's discussion of the data call-in, and might like to see more work in that area where it's under your authority. But another thing I wanted to call attention to was all the work you guys have done to ask for and make known the kind of information you want, partly through these workshops and stakeholder interactions, but also in my world, I see it at your presence at conferences. We're going to have this Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry conference here in November, and you guys are going to be out in force. So it's a really great way to reach out to both industry and the scientific community to let everyone know this is the kind of data that's really going to inform our regulation and our work going forward. So I just wanted to compliment you on that ongoing effort. Then in terms of, this is something that Gina brought up, great talk, the selection of priority products. I'm an advocate of the current jump around approach. There were a bunch of thoughts about how one could hone the process for choosing these priorities, and I really like that you guys have taken a lot of different approaches. Some of yours have been, I would say, low-hanging fruit, but the sick antelope is very the great metaphor that was new to me. Some of your priority products are going to have really tricky alternative, maybe no possible alternative, who knows. Some are focused more on human health, some are on ecotox. So I really appreciate that you've taken this broad look, but do want to note it can sometimes limit the efficiencies that could develop if you honed in on just one or two of these approaches. And then, last little point, small point, but CalSafer is so great, and the TIC is not. So I really like CalSafer. It's great.
Getting better all the time.
Thank you, Becky. So I've got Meg and Mike, and then maybe I'll offer Gina a chance to say a few words and see if there's any last thoughts she wants from us. We need to wrap up at 1:45.
This is just a small point that I had made a note of during Gina's presentation that we haven't returned to as a panel, which is one of the things that you called out among the responses were there was that one very clear statement from a business person about how impossible the economic analysis is in alternatives assessment. And I just wanted to return to this because we were talking about it a little bit yesterday, and I had a proposal that might be far out, but I wanted to link to this idea, which is one of those costs is easier for government and very hard for businesses, which is the cost to government agencies. That's one of the things that's stipulated, right? And maybe that's some guidance that the agency could give to responsible parties, what government agencies are bearing the cost and what some of the costs are. But then I started thinking about what kind of guidance could we give companies about some of the other public health costs. Wasn't yesterday there a conversation about, or maybe this was something that Carl gave in his update about the workshop that you had about looking at like accounting for public health costs through air pollution. We certainly have more data on that for air pollution because the associated health effects are better known. But there is some European literature about economic impacts of endocrine disruptor exposure, and you're probably familiar with all this literature, but obviously you're already making an effort in this direction because you're holding workshops like that. But I guess I would just support that and say, since we know this is an area that, as we see it, the analysis has fallen down and businesses themselves are saying this is a really hard area to do, just to support your ongoing work in providing as much input as possible to the process in those areas that we expect to be underdeveloped in the AA process. And it's wonderful to hear from Jack that that's a very familiar part of an assessment to Unilever, at least, is some of those more like public health impacts. And so perhaps there's even some industry best practices, roundtable stuff that could happen to, or maybe they have to be confidential conversations or something about how folks who are considering this are trying to pull in that information and do that accounting, just in support of that.
Thanks, Meg. So moving quickly, I've got Mike, and actually I'd like to throw in Jack before we go to Gina.
I'll try and be quick. I just want to kind of reiterate what Meredith said is I want us to be aware that with the mattress pads, that was a big success. You know, I view that if we look at what was done here, it's about safer consumer products. It's not about the safest. It's not about no consumer products. It's about safer. And there was a step change in that area based on what the department did. Now, could there be additional step change? Absolutely. But I think what gets modeled here is we're focusing a lot on the end part of the process, on the AAs. But what to me is also a very effective part of the process is developing the work plan. Because when the work plan comes out, you're not to the point of a specific product with a specific chemical necessarily. You're with a group of products with a group of chemicals that the department's going to start to look at. And that's when industry looks at what the activity is going to be. So if you kind of go along, what Helen was saying was, okay, maybe you have an off-ramp that says, I'm going to remove this and I'm not going to add a chemical of concern. But maybe it's even as simple as you get your off-ramp if you're going to remove the chemical of concern and you're not going to add any of the ones we were considering on top of it to replace. You know, then you've created more definition, because I think what's lacking is some definition on some of these fast tracks. And maybe there are ways to do it that provide a continuous improvement, because you're never going to get perfection, step one, but if you get continuous improvement, that's a pathway to go. And I think the work plan crafting has been very well done, and that's, I think, where you come up with, we don't have any AAs now to work on, because the department has crafted very well-considered work plans and gotten the data out there, and then done public outreach and discussed what's in the work plan, discussed what's going to be a priority product, and kept that iterative action.
Continuous improvement. Jack.
Just a quick point. We've mentioned REACH a few times. REACH obviously is all-encompassing. But I just want to point out that in terms of chemical management, the Canadian system, in our view, is far superior. And in fact, I tell my European colleagues, REACH was actually based on the Canadian Chemical Management Plan, which they don't like to hear, but it was actually done really well. They prioritized very strictly and then followed through in a very definite timetable. So I would encourage you to look at the Canadian Chemical Management Plan managed by both Health Canada and Environment Canada as a model for prioritization, because it's really worked well. And I think industry has contributed a lot of safety information in support of ingredients that were prioritized. So I'll leave it at that.
So now I'd like to offer Gina an opportunity for any remarks or questions that we might address in our last 10 minutes.
Wow, so much valuable information, so many good thoughts and ideas. So thank you all for the discussion. This was really, really useful in both validating some things and in also making me sort of rethink a few things and sort of honing some of the thoughts. So I do also want to say that I'd be very happy to have like any follow-up conversations. So if any of you want to just talk more or have ideas after you leave this room, feel free to reach out. We can hop on the phone or sit down and talk more because I am still actively trying to tweak my ideas. I think, there is this funny tension, even in the discussion just now, about the indirect regulatory impacts of the program, which I'm sort of hearing, and I heard in the interviews also, are probably quite significant, and how important that is. And there were even people who said the program should put out a lot of sort of flags out there, should name a lot of potential priority products, but then shouldn't rush to get them across the finish line. Because in fact, that very sort of drawn out process is valuable in sort of getting, allowing all this innovation to happen. But then, of course, there's what we also talked about, the fact that a lot of that does happen behind the scenes then, and it's not visible, it's difficult to measure. And there are certainly, and I can tell you this for sure, lots of folks out there who don't really fully believe it's happening if they don't see it. So then, and then on the flips, and then also sort of in this set of considerations is but if you rely on the indirect, then the alternatives analysis, which, as Carl pointed out, is the cornerstone of the program, actually ends up being sort of an appendix. It's not really critical. Because in most cases, they're off-ramps that are being taken. And so there's this set of tensions right in there that is a bit of a tangle. And so if anybody has additional thoughts on that, there are certainly people, the people who, wanted to drive everything through the alternatives analysis want to do that to maximize transparency and to really try to stick with this idea of avoiding regrettable substitutes. And I get that. That's a valid way of thinking. But also another valid way of thinking is to say, okay, let's get innovation happening behind the scenes, and all kinds of changes will occur. But is that really the way we want to go? So I'd love to hear just a little more about that, because I'm struggling with that point in particular.
Tim, Meg.
I was thinking about that too, especially, I've never been a complete adherent to the notion of this self-regulatory thing, because I think a lot of it, because it happens in the shadows, there's a lot of opportunity for strategic behavior and whatnot. But it does seem to be a real thing. And what strikes me is, I think this ties in with the information call-in authority so deeply, because in two ways. One, if you're going to be having those kind of interactions with people, pre-regulatory, it would be useful to come to the table with a lot more information. That the only source of information in many cases is what they're willing to tell you in those discussions. And it's difficult to confirm whether that's true or not. So having call-in authority or some kind of information authority, I think would better prepare folks for using that pre-regulatory period. But also, perhaps more importantly, having that authority would also allow you to measure whether you're actually having an effect or not. So it would be nice before everything starts to know who's using what and for what purpose, and then to be able afterwards to go back and find out who's using what and for what purpose to really measure if there's been a change. So I agree with you, Mike. I think it's a success story, maybe. It depends on what they did, right? So the whole regrettable substitution thing casts a shadow on whether it's a success story or not. So information, I think, is key to making that real and measurable. And, you know, and I think about what kind of reforms and this whole debate about regulatory versus legislative reform. And of course, the real danger with legislative reform is like once you open it up, you don't know what you're going to end up with. So I think there's good reason to be cautious about that. But like when I think about it, I think, you know, information, my thing would be think about how to be more creative with the authorities that you do have. That would be an interesting thing to look at in an evaluation. And then try and get more authority, because I think of all, maybe besides funding, of all the suggestions about legislative changes, getting more information collection authority or generation authority, I think is key to this program.
Got Meg and Ken.
I really appreciate everything that Tim just said. And the place that I go with this is to notification. That maybe, Gina, you kind of outlined two extremes purposefully to provoke our thinking, I think. But that perhaps there's something in the middle that lets the indirect impacts happen, but also feeds some information to the department. And that would be, in my mind, actually, a relatively simple notification provision, like what Helen was talking about, the kinds of things that we discussed years and years and years ago, but that probably was not as easy to see how it would work as it is now, that comes into force early in the process, like work plan timing or something like that. That's a simple notification. Are you using this as of the work plan or not? And then at the time of, I don't know, I haven't thoroughly thought this through, but there's something about collecting some baseline information, like Tim was just talking about, who's using this in these product categories, and some later point time information. But that's a simple notification that doesn't go quite to the level of authority of a big, far-reaching data call-in, which of course I would love, but is maybe less realistic in terms of requesting increased authorities.
Thank you. Those are very creative suggestions. And I think, Meg, or Meredith, do you want to weigh in before we go to Ken? Okay. So we're going to wrap up the last of the panel input on this topic with Ken Geiser. It's very appropriate.
I don't know about appropriate. It sounds like the end of the road or something. Well, I'll reinforce my colleagues, Megan and Tim. I wouldn't necessarily call that self-regulation, because I think I have my own problems with self-regulation as well. But I think what I was trying to capitalize on was the capacity that the law allows the department, and the department actually is practicing in calling people together about developing the information and finding out what the alternatives are and really taking that out there toward the kind of sectoral programs that we are seeing spontaneously, that's the wrong word, arising in various sectors like the textile sector or the electronics sector or the office equipment sector or even the auto sector, where there's dialogues going on that are really about alternatives and people sharing information and all of that. And it's a low cost kind of thing in the sense of legal costs and in the sense of having to meet various legal standards and stuff. But it would be a way, and then as Meg is sort of doing, is sort of assess what the impact of that is. Say that the message of the department is, this is a priority area that we're thinking of. We want to spend 9 months working with the firms to see how far we can get in developing alternatives and working together and all. And to the degree that we are headed for some serious rulemaking in this area, we may be only having to make those rules for the laggards, because in fact, a lot of the leaders moved during that time, or at least had the dialogue, and the market is shifting, and therefore, you're in such a much better position to do the work. Now, it's true, your point is well taken, that, gosh, we did all this work on getting the protocol for the alternative assessment worked out. Is it just some kind of weapon now? Right? I would say no. I'd be kind of doubly cute about it, and during that information gathering, seed those discussions with, here's a clever way to do your alternatives assessment, and also that people are actually doing the alternative assessments, they're not really required to, but anyway, there'd just be some really open and interesting areas. You're right, I have colleagues in the NGO community in California that probably would find that distasteful, but I basically think there's a lot of productive space here, and I urge the department God, now can I make a closing statement? In the future, as you move forward in what is truly a successful program, that these are the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that I think is really going to drive it. So, good.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I don't think I can say anything to improve on that. So I would just like to thank Dr. Solomon and her team for getting the funding and conducting this review and having the dialogue with us. I want to thank the panel members. This has been a little difficult to chair. I think there's a lot of energy and useful stuff here, and I appreciate your patience with me and your thoughtful input on this. And I want to thank the staff. It's a hard thing to go through this kind of review and think about all of those things. So I appreciate the approach that you all and the whole team are taking on this. It's not a critique of you. It's really a thoughtful process about supporting the program and taking it to the next level. And I also really want to thank the AA team for their incredible patience. We're still waiting on one final presentation from Heather Lee and one last little discussion before this meeting adjourns at 12:30. So I'm going to turn it over to Art for the next steps.
Thank you, Kelly. As Kelly mentioned, we have two final agenda items for the last 45 minutes, starting with a presentation on the preliminary alternatives analysis template, and then 25 minutes for panel discussion, and then last couple of minutes with closing remarks, and Kelly and I will go over some of the action items. So Heather?
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Lee, and for this portion of the meeting, I am presenting the Preliminary Alternatives Analysis Report template. First of all, I would like to thank you all for the thoughtful advice and suggestions over the past couple of days. It was very insightful to hear. The goal of this session is to get your feedback regarding this first iteration of the template. Hopefully you've had a chance to look it over. If not, it's provided to you in your packet. So first of all, you can find the template and other useful resources on our website under the Alternatives Analysis Resources. I know when we talk about alternatives analysis, it can seem a bit overwhelming at first. So to help stakeholders with the process and from the recommendation of the GRASS members, we created this template. The purpose of the template is to help responsible entities organize and present their report to fulfill the regulatory requirements. Before we go further, I want to highlight that the template is not intended to be a standalone guidance document. We previously released the AA guide, as shown here on the right. That contains detailed guidance on how to conduct an AA. It's critical that the responsible entities read the regulations and become familiar with the AA guide before using the template. And it's also optional for stakeholders. They can use this template or any format of their choosing. As a reminder, the AA process consists of 2 stages. The first stage is the screening and scoping phase. where the responsible entity identifies alternatives that warrant further consideration. And the second stage is where the more in-depth analysis of the alternatives selected from that first stage is conducted. Once the responsible entity completes the first stage, they submit their results in a preliminary AA report to the department. And the template we created only pertains to this first stage AA. For the second stage, the RE presents their findings in a final AA report using any format of their choosing. As a note about the final AA, we want the responsible entities to be able to present their decision-making as they see best fits their needs within the framework of the regulations. And at this time, we do not intend to create a final AA template, as the flexibility of the regulations makes it challenging to create a template that would not limit that flexibility. So here's a closer look at the template. This is an abbreviated table of contents. There is an executive summary, and the first two sections are related to contact information. Section 3 is the priority product information. This is where the function, performance, and legal requirements of the priority product and alternatives are discussed. In Section 4, the scope of relevant comparison factors. Here we ask the responsible entity to go through the factors, exposure pathways, and life cycle segments and determine which are relevant for evaluation and comparison of their priority product and alternatives. And for any that they determine not to be relevant, we ask them to explain their rationale. In Section 5, the responsible entity describes the alternatives considered and explains the rationale for those alternatives not selected for further evaluation. In Section 6, the responsible entity describes which alternatives were selected for further evaluation in the second stage. And Section 7 is the work plan for the second stage AA. Now, the challenging part that we found in creating the template was trying to create a useful document for our stakeholders while being careful to accommodate the flexibility of the regulations, and at the same time making sure not to create any standards of general applicability that would constitute underground regulation. So with that, we would like to take this time to let the panel discuss the template, and we will take your feedback. Here are the questions we posed to the panel. Please feel free to comment however you find most appropriate. We welcome your suggestions and hope to learn from you how we can improve the template. We will use your feedback and also feedback from responsible entities that actually use the template to iterate and improve the design in future versions. Thank you, and we look forward to your comments.
Heather, thank you very much for your presentation. Let's just see if there are any clarifying questions that for Heather before we jump into providing our input. Seeing none, let's open up the floor for input and discussion on the template. We'll start with Helen.
Hi, Heather. As a person who makes a lot of templates, I have to say, good start. Because I know that for those of you who don't live in this kind of world of making forms and whatever, you're probably going, what? Because all you're doing is asking for who this is. You know, I got to tell you, even just that really baseline stuff is going to help you sort through these files much, much faster. So it doesn't seem necessarily like you've got this density or guide or whatever. It's actually very helpful. But here's what I will say is that some gaps or suggestions maybe, is that in the factor detail section, right now you just list the section and you're like, and it's like a narrative form. One thing that you might find to be helpful is tick boxes at the beginning of each section of which factors you are including or excluding, however you'd like to sort it out. Because if you have to dig into the text every single time you hit a section, you will find yourself really inundated. It's a very easy fix. It's definitely not an underground reg. It's just taking it to that level. And especially in the cases where you've got many, many potential factors in a category, you're going to find that to be, I think, a helpful thing. And then I think the other question you had was whether it's okay to not have the final template. I suspect you will eventually want one, but if you want to wait on that one, I think the preliminary is the more urgent, obviously, of the two, since it's earlier in the pipeline. Again, having some experience in getting lots of different test methods and ways of articulating the results, I strongly suspect you're going to want final, even, but if you want to cross that bridge later, that's fine.
Thank you, Helen. Mark?
I think that some of the relevant factors are maybe need to be reordered. I mean, sort of just, you start out with adverse environmental impacts and adverse public health impacts and so forth, but those are going to follow from what you know about environmental fate, right? And which follows from physiochemical properties. So, there's more like a logical order to think about, well, okay, here's the stuff, okay, how much of it, how much is getting out, where's it going to go, and then exposure factors, how are people going to be exposed to it, which leads to then what you're thinking of the impacts are, in terms of public health impacts and ecological, environmental impacts. So I'm not saying the factors are wrong, I'm just saying they kind of should be reorganized, I think, in the way that I think about it. No. How about that? Okay. And just one other comment. Actually, this came up when I asked about it yesterday. How much of life cycle analysis is required in these alternative assessments? And I remember Meredith saying, "What's life cycle thinking?" But this preliminary alternatives thinking has a lot of thinking about life cycle analysis here. So I'm kind of wondering whether you're actually looking for that level of detail in this sort of proposal.
Thank you, Mark. Mike?
So I also think this is very well done. I think it gives people room to think on a preliminary basis, which is where you want them to be. The one thing that kind of drew my attention was when you get to the selected alternative or alternatives, is that by giving that latitude already in the preliminary analysis, if they can just say, oh, here's the alternative we're going to evaluate, have you gotten to a foregone conclusion of here's what we're going to do? Now here's what we're using now. We can't have that. So here's the one alternative we're going to consider going to the final AA. Do we really want that? And I don't know if it's wrong or right. That would be my concern, is there might need to just be some discussion within the template of, if you've only got one alternative, you need to have some really solid information to us as to why there's only one alternative. Or if you only have one alternative, please have a discussion with DTSC so we can give you some other ideas to think about. Because, I think we've heard a lot that, okay, people are just picking an alternative and going with it, and there are better solutions. So that would just be the fear I have with the way it's written right now.
Thank you, Mike. Kelly?
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the staff, and we keep asking for these kinds of things, and I'm very pleased that you all are responding and trying to think through what that balance is about being too prescriptive and being, but not, being open enough on these things. I'm thinking about this from the point of view of being someone reviewing them. And I review a lot of pesticide risk assessment. So part of my job is to look at the ecological risk assessment for every pesticide that EPA reviews and say, have they missed a pathway that's important for the area that I work in, which is urban runoff and wastewater discharges. And the consistency and format of those risk assessments is very helpful. Because then I know where to look and my review goes more quickly. I'm expecting that when DTSC gets an AA, it's going to have an interdisciplinary team of folks who are going to be reviewing them, because no one reviewer is going to have all the expertise to say where are the gaps, what's missing, because so much of this science review is a gap review. And so I guess I would ask you all to give a little thought about encouraging people to have some consistency in format, perhaps at a little greater detail level than's here. The other way of dealing with this is where Helen was heading with the checklists. There are certain things that I use that are really important for me to quickly scan through things. And one of them is that, and you might just take a look at EPA's pesticide risk assessments. They have a very standard format in the ecological risk assessment, in the human health risk assessments. They're horrible, ugly documents. And when you go to, I can help you guys find an electronic docket with some examples of these things. But you go to the docket and there's 12 different things that together comprise the risk assessment. So it's a real pain in the butt to look at them. But what they have done is use some standard tools and formats to help organize things and make sure they catch everything. And that's exactly the goal of the template, is to try to make sure that we catch everything and to facilitate the review. So in the ecological risk assessment, I look for, there's a summary table where they put summarize the environmental fate and data all in one place, so that chemistry, environmental fate, all in one place, always the same order with the same things that are listed. And as soon as you scan through that, you can say, oh, this stuff's going to land in air, this stuff's going to land in water. I mean, you can do a pretty quick review. It's going to decompose quickly, therefore I need to think about the degradates. It's going to be mobile in water or not. That table is just so crucial to focusing the reviewer's effort. The second thing that I use just every time, and I feel like I'm the broken record on conceptual models, but it's the conceptual model. And that's why I keep bringing up the standard conceptual models as a tool packet, and the ability to start with what EPA did for Tosca and fix the mistakes in that and perhaps provide that to people. But the conceptual model also really quickly allows me to see that there's a mistake. So there's a pathway they didn't realize. That means that they left out as a relevant factor. For me, it's something about water quality. So, oh, they didn't understand that this stuff falls on hard surfaces and runs into storm drains and gets into creek in minutes instead of weeks. So they missed that whole pathway, and therefore they missed that whole impact chain, and therefore they weren't thinking about aquatic toxicity. That happens to me all the time. Yeah, I'll open up a risk assessment and I can look through and very quickly find the gaps in the conceptual model that cause then the mistakes in the risk assessment that are the purpose of the public peer review, and that's the purpose of the agency peer review. So that's just the other area would be, so thinking further about tables and checklists that might facilitate DTSC's review, particularly thinking about how you're going to break up and do that review process when you get the AAs. So what skill sets are going to be the different represented ones on the team? Because clearly you'll have some people who look at the whole thing, but you're going to need to parse that out, and anything that you can do in the format that helps facilitate that will save you money in the long term. So that's food for thought, and thank you again.
Kelly, thank you very much. Let me go to Tim and then come back to Helen. Tim?
Thank you. I just thought this was really thoughtfully and carefully done, so I think it's a really nice template. And I just had a couple of short comments on it. One, I think Kelly should stop calling the conceptual model thing a broken record. I think you should think of it as one of your greatest hits. Right? And who doesn't want to hear those? And on this, I just had a couple of minor, I think, kind of comments. One is, I like the idea that in the kind of little bracketed areas, you reference the AA guide to kind of send people back to that. And I would encourage you to do it some more. Like, it's in the scope of relevant comparison factors. You might think about putting it, you know, like in the alternatives considered area, because I think that's helpful. I mean, there's always this tension in a template between wanting to just be structural, but at the same time wanting it to have a substantive component to it, because you're also structuring how people think about stuff. So I think having the click over to the guide is really great. I would use it a little bit more. And then the other thing I would just say is there is something in the regs for these consideration of additional information beyond the relevant factors. God forbid we should add more things to it, I know. But it does like encourage or allow people to consider other things beyond, and in fact, to consider things from that they would normally think about in the second stage AA. And I didn't see it in here, I may have just missed it, but it might be helpful to somehow get that built into here as well. Maybe not so much because you want people to be looking at the other things, but as a trigger to, if they are thinking about other stuff, a reminder that they need to identify that as well. So that's my only comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Helen?
Right, there was one section that I was particularly interested in, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it before, is the work plan. This was one that when we did our internal pilots of this, we really struggled on this section of what exactly you're kind of looking for. So I know that this is not the final version of what you're going to want this section to be, but I will kind of commend you for at least putting a stake in the ground. And, you know, as you get farther in, I'm going to be watching this one. Now, if we keep it as simple as this, that's actually terrific, by the way. It does not have to be elaborate or whatever. It's just like, I'm going to do X and Y and Z, and it's going to be done by this and that, and this is what I'll know at the end. If we can keep it simple, that's better. But that work plan section, I don't know that people appreciate how tough it is, because the final is not, it's not structured. And so I could go in and say anything. You know, I could say, my action is I'm going to do the hokey pokey, and I'm going to have that done by next week. And then whichever, you know, if my foot is in this box, I'm going to use that alternative. And there's nothing technically that says that that's not compliant. So, but we definitely did have, again, we tried this a couple of different times, and I made my team iterate through some variations on this. I anticipate you needing to do a little bit more, is my guess, is that it'll need a little bit more. An example or something.
Thank you. Meg?
As usual, Helen's making me think about something, which I appreciate. Just to elaborate on that, from my experience in our Greener Solutions program, our class, where we've, based on our past experience, implemented an early presentation within the class that we just did last week. So that's like the third week of classes or something, where the students are presenting their understanding of the topic so far and their challenge. And the most important piece of information that we get from that is their last slide, where they say, these are our remaining questions about this challenge. And that's what really tells me they understand what they're dealing with. They know what questions they have to answer. They know, you know, what resources they lack. Like, they can't have figured it all out by then, but they've learned enough about the topic that they know what their questions are. And I kind of see this or that's at least a piece of the function that this serves. And so I wonder if there's a way to even specifically kind of call that out of, like, what questions do you need to answer to be able to complete a final AA?
Thank you. Let me see if there are any more comments or input on the preliminary AA template. Seeing none, so we're about 5 minutes early in terms of going to meeting closeouts. At this point, I'm going to ask Meredith for her closing remarks.
Thank you. This was our most ambitious grasp, at least since I've been in the department, and we weren't sure we could quite pull it off, that it was a lot to digest. We gave you more reading material than we normally do. Everybody was prepared, thoughtful, insightful, and gave us a lot of very valuable information. The reason we could do such an ambitious meeting was because of staff. Staff, first of all, I don't pay any attention to the logistics anymore. And that's because the team they've got it dialed in, everything works. I don't lose any sleep over it. And so I just want to thank all the folks who've made that happen, one of whom stepped out of the room, one of the key folks here. And so thank you to everybody. We have a great system for getting volunteers from across the program, whether or not your area of the program is on the agenda, people step up and contribute, and that's very helpful. I am going to single out Ann Cooper Doherty. And I know the co-chairs would echo this, just for her thoughtfulness in terms of thinking in challenging ways about what we're trying to do, and also being a very nice terrier to get me to keep moving on pulling together the materials. So I just can't thank staff enough, and Ann Cooper in particular, for all their contributions to make this a successful meeting. As always, the co-chairs, you were really game this time around. And I think that early on you were a little skeptical about a couple of the things we were proposing and not quite sure it was going to work out. And I think that helped us go back to the drawing board a couple times and reshape our thinking. And I think it paid off tremendously. And as you acknowledged, Kelly, this was a tough one to facilitate, this morning's conversation in particular, just because so many, where do you go with it? And you guided it expertly, both of you, and so that we got, I think, as much as one could possibly hope out of the meeting. So thank you very, very much.
Well, at this point, I'm going to ask Kelly if she has any action items she wants to highlight for us.
Yeah, I do have a few. Gina asked for any follow-up from us, and I'll let the staff send out her email address to the science panel members. And I'm suspecting she needs that quickly, so any contact and any conversation within, say, the next 2 weeks, is that? All right, so just to light a fire under you, if you have additional thoughts, make those notes on the way home. And yes.
Could we flip that around? And also, I'm not going to offer all of us, but feel free to contact us as well if you have specific questions you think individuals on the panel would be helpful with.
Yeah, so that's one action item. I'm expecting, based on the conversation and decision-making and the items we came up with, that'll come back in a future meeting. And I particularly want to thank Tim and Mike and Mike's colleague from Method to spending so much time preparing for that and supporting the staff and being just so wonderful in that rather difficult discussion to facilitate, but a really important thing. On the AA evaluation update, I really want to reiterate I think, strong recommendation to see that get published in a peer-reviewed journal, and more generally to be looking towards making that an element of the program design. So last time, we've come and recommended you get your folks to conferences, and you've done a really excellent job at that, and I'm hoping that will continue in getting around the nation and the world. And I think Elaine's comment shows that you've been doing that and how important and effective that has been for this program and for the state of California. A small investment is really paying off in a really huge way in terms of our impact. I know there were a ton of other things that came out of all of these discussions that the staff are going to be following up on. So I'm not going to attempt to even begin to list those items, but I'm sure that we're going to see those pop out in various ways, most of which won't involve coming back to the panel, but a few of which might. And I want to encourage the continued action on the part of the panel to support the staff. This all happens behind the scenes, but I know that various folks have done different things individually when the staff is reaching out, and their follow-up on a specific request, or answer another question that they know, ask you another question that you know they have expertise. I've personally been following up on the panel's recommendation to work with the department and other agencies to see what we can do about getting more environmental monitoring data, particularly the water quality monitoring data. So that's a particular piece that I've continued on, but I know that other folks have also been continuing on these kinds of things. So I want to acknowledge and thank you all for your individual support outside of these meetings for the department. That's really, really important. And then both for that and in your participation here, it's a big effort and a big contribution to our state and to our state's future that you all are making by donating your time, your unpaid time, to come to these meetings and help make this program successful. So I really do want to thank everyone here, including the staff, who, although you are paid, I think you are doing something that's very unique and requires going the extra mile in a lot of different ways. It's much harder than a regular job. So thank everyone for making that contribution to California's future. So with those remarks, I know Director Williams has something else to say, and I'm sure Art will have some words in closing.
Yeah, I was quite remiss. I did not thank our speakers, and I want to thank all of our speakers from staff, from the panel, and Ryan, and especially this is the first time we've had external speakers, so thank you, Gina, and thanks to Ryan Williams for his participation yesterday. Again, asking you to prepare on top of everything else you have going on is a very heavy lift, and so we really appreciate it, and I'm really proud of staff and the presentations they put together. So thank you.
Yeah, we should say something about that.
February or March? I don't think we want to, we haven't, yeah. We have to look, because the panel was kind enough to give us all of their typical meetings that they attend and what those schedules are, we'll cross-reference that list, that master list we have. We'll also try and see if there's another climate summit happening and avoid that.
We'll see you all at the symposium, of course.
So, but we haven't done that legwork, and that's why I wasn't prepared to propose any dates.
But we are anticipating the next meeting of the panel to be in the winter, spring of 2019.
I see Ann wants to make a comment. Ann?
So just a suggestion that came up from some topics, talking to some other panel members last night and this morning. We've talked about our global impact of this small but mighty program. I think it might be helpful. There are two panel members, and forgive me ahead of time for volunteering you, who have presentations that I think would be useful, or ongoing work that would be helpful for us to put us in the global context. Helen spoke last night about a prepared talk that she has on hand about global trends that I think would be interesting, and you prepared that for HP. You want to say a titch more about that? And it's obviously up to all of you as to if that's a good use of our time, but I think it would be a helpful context. And then the other one is Ken Geiser is wrapping up work on a UN Global Chemicals Outlook report, and I think would be really interesting to hear about that as well. So think about that in your future agenda.
Yes, May.
I think that has been said generally in the thanks to staff, but I feel like our participation in this Green Urban Science panel meeting was so facilitated by the specificity of the input that we were given, and I just wanted to acknowledge that because I think it's really hard. There's a lot of hard work that goes into that, staff and leadership and our co-chairs, and it makes it so much easier for us to help when there's all that really specific guidance and background, and the analysis that you did of the AAs that you've looked at, and all of that really gives us material that we can dig into and be more useful. And so I just wanted to say that I appreciate how much work that was on so many people's part, and that it really helps.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let me just also add my thanks to the staff. And when we were planning the agenda, one of the things coming from Apple, I'm always pushing to be as ambitious as possible. And when Ann Cooper and Meredith actually showed me the agenda, I said, well, this is way too ambitious. However, they pulled it off, and thank you very much to the panel for your insight and for your energy. If there are no other comments, meeting adjourned.